You want me gone? Then you're going to have to drag me out by force, Mr. Holt, because I am not leaving this land." Clara May Whitlock said it loud enough for every soul on Main Street to hear. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. The only thing moving was the torn deed, Bernard Holt's fraudulent deed, the one he'd just shoved in her face and demanded she sign over, fluttering in two pieces from her fingers, down into the Willow Creek dust. The banker's face went the color of old ash. The crowd went absolutely silent. Because that document was supposed to end her, and she had just destroyed it with her bare hands. If you are new to this channel, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell about women who refuse to be erased. Men who forgot how to feel until someone reminded them, and love that nobody in town saw coming until it was already real. Before we go one step further, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story we tell together. And when you finish watching today, please leave a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Willow Creek, Montana, the summer of 1885, and find out exactly who Clara May Whitlock was and what she was really up against. She had not planned to make a scene. That was the truth. And it mattered to her, because Clara May Whitlock had spent the better part of 28 years trying very hard not to make scenes. She had been raised by a woman who believed that dignity was its own argument, that the best answer to cruelty was competence, and that the kind of people who needed to raise their voice to be heard had usually run out of more powerful options. Clara believed all of that. She had believed it through the years of whispers back east, through the loss of her father, through the slow dissolution of everything her family had built, through the long, rattling stagecoach ride across 1,100 miles of increasingly untamed country. She had believed it right up until the moment Bernard Holt put a piece of paper in front of her and told her to sign it. Then she had torn it in half instead. That document, Holt said, his voice dropping into a register that was meant to be dangerous, was a legal instrument. "Mrs. Whitlock, you have just destroyed a legal instrument in front of witnesses." "I have just destroyed a forgery in front of witnesses," Clara said, "which is a different thing entirely. The real deed to this property is in my cedar box in my room at Dora Finch's boarding house, and it has my father's signature on it, and a territorial seal, and a date that precedes whatever that piece of theater was by 4 years. She looked at him steadily. "Would you like to discuss it further? I'm happy to have that conversation in front of every person on this street." Holt looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Clara. Nobody moved. How was a large man, not tall, but wide in the way of men who had never been told no by anything that mattered, with a face that had been constructed for intimidation, and currently wasn't finding its usual purchase. He wore a gray suit that cost more than most men in Willow Creek earned in a month, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who are accustomed to other people filling silence on their behalf. Nobody filled the silence. "You're making a mistake," Holt said. "I make mistakes all the time," Clara said. "This isn't one of them." She bent down and picked up the two halves of the torn deed from the dust. She folded them together neatly and tucked them into the pocket of her coat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holt." She walked away from him down Main Street with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not turn around, and she did not let herself breathe properly until she had rounded the corner by the livery and was out of sight of the crowd. Then she stopped walking, put one hand on the wall of the livery, and breathed. Her heart was going like a runaway horse. Her legs felt like they'd been replaced with something unreliable. She stood there for a full minute just breathing until the shaking passed. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," said a voice behind her, "or the most foolish, possibly both." Clara turned. A woman was sitting on a barrel outside the livery door, watching her with dark, amused eyes. She was somewhere around 50, with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered competence that comes from a lifetime of doing things herself. She had a horseshoe in one hand and didn't appear to be planning to put it down anytime soon. "Coot's wife," Clara guessed. "Sister," the woman said. "Nora, you must be the Whitlock woman Coot won't stop talking about." She looked Clara up and down without any apparent judgment, the way you assess a piece of work to determine its quality. "Bernard Holt just tried to run the same scheme on the Adler family last month. They signed." She paused. They lost the property inside of 3 weeks. Clara felt something cold move through her chest. He's done this before. Twice that I know of, Nora said. Different paperwork each time, same result. She turned the horseshoe over in her hands. You got a lawyer? Not yet, Clara said. You need one, Nora said. Holt doesn't give up because someone tears up his paperwork. He just goes away and comes back with more paperwork and a different angle. She set the horseshoe down on the barrel beside her and looked at Clara directly. How long have you been in town? 4 hours, Clara said. Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Lord, in a tone that contained both admiration and deep concern, and went back inside the livery. Clara stood in the lane and thought about what Nora had just told her, and what it meant, and what came next. She thought about the Adler family, whoever they were, wherever they were now, and the property they'd lost to a man in a gray suit who knew how to construct legal-looking paper out of lies and intimidation. Then she straightened up, took a breath, and went to find a lawyer. The only lawyer in Willow Creek was a man named Samuel Bright, who operated out of a single room above the general store, and who, when Clara came up the stairs and knocked on his door, opened it in his shirt sleeves with ink on his fingers and the look of a man who had not expected company. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, because evidently news in Willow Creek moved faster than she did. I heard what happened on Main Street. Then you know why I'm here, Clara said. I need to understand what Holt can and can't do legally, and I need to understand it today. Samuel Bright stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. How was younger than she'd expected, early 30s, with an honest face, and the kind of careful manner that suggested he had learned to think before he spoke, possibly through some formative experience of the alternative. He listened to Clara's account of the encounter with Holt, without interrupting, occasionally writing something down in a small notebook, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The scheme he's running, Samuel said, works like this. He produces a deed that looks legitimate close enough that someone without legal training and without their original documents close at hand would have a hard time contesting it on the spot. He presents it as a correction to an existing filing error, or a tax lien, redemption, or sometimes a surveying discrepancy. He tells the property owner that their title is contested, and this document resolves the contest. If they sign, they've transferred the property. If they don't sign immediately, he comes back with a different version and more pressure. How many properties has he taken this way? Clara said. Samuel hesitated. In Willow Creek, that I can prove 2. He paused. That I suspect closer to 6. 6 families, Clara said quietly. Some of them have left the territory, Samuel said. Some are still here working land they used to own for wages. He looked at her. Your deed, the real one, is it clean? No encumbrances, no outstanding liens. None, Clara said. My father paid the territorial filing fees in 1879. The deed is registered in Helena. Then your position is strong, Samuel said. But Mrs. Whitlock, he stopped. Say it, Clara said. Holt has relationships with people in this territory that complicate simple legal positions, Samuel said carefully. The county assessor, a territorial judge who rides this circuit. I'm not saying the law won't protect you. I'm saying that the law sometimes moves slower than men like Holt, and in the meantime, he has other tools. What kind of tools? Clara said. Samuel looked at her steadily. Pressure. On suppliers. On people you might need to do business with. On anyone in town who might help you. He paused. He did it to the Adlers. Their credit at the general store was pulled within a week. Nobody would hire their eldest son. Their well went dry around the same time a man Holt employs was seen on their property, but nothing was proven. Clara sat with that for a moment. He poisons the water, she said. Sometimes literally, Samuel said. Then quickly, I don't have proof of that. Don't put it about that I said it. I'm not interested in what I can't prove, Clara said. Right now. I may become interested in it later. She stood up. What do I owe you for today? Nothing yet, Samuel said. Come back when something happens. Because something will happen. I know, Clara said. She went back to the boarding house. Dora Finch was in the front room when Clara came through the door, and she looked up with the expression of a woman who had also heard what happened on Main Street and had made a decision about it. "Sit down," Dora said. "I'll put coffee on." Clara sat down. The cedar box was upstairs in her room, and she felt the pull of it, the need to check that the real deed was still there, still intact, the way you check on something precious after a scare, even when you know logically it's fine. She resisted the pull. It was fine. It was always fine, until it wasn't, and checking didn't change which it was. "Bernard Holt," Dora said from the kitchen, in a tone that had a word underneath it that proper women didn't say, "has been a problem in this town for 3 years. Nobody's stopped him because nobody's had the nerve to stand up to him in public." A pause. The sound of a kettle. "Until today." "I wasn't trying to be heroic," Clara said. "I was angry." Dora came back with 2 cups and sat across from Clara at the table. "Child," she said, "you want to know something I've learned in 52 years of watching people angry and heroic look exactly the same from the outside. What matters is what you do next." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I stay," she said. "That's what I do next. I go out to the property, and I work it, and I build something real, and I don't give him a legal foothold anywhere." Dora nodded slowly. "You're going to need allies," she said. "I know," Clara said. "Most of the town will wait and see which way the wind blows before they pick a side," Dora said. "That's just people. It's not personal." "I know that too," Clara said. "But not everyone will wait," Dora said. She looked at Clara over the rim of her cup. "There are people in this territory who don't like what Holt's been doing and have been waiting for a reason to say so out loud. You may have just given them one." Clara thought about Nora at the livery. She thought about Samuel Bright and the careful way he'd said, "I'm not saying the law won't protect you." She thought about the 6 families, the ones she could prove, and the ones she suspected, and the Adlers working their own land for wages now. "I hope so," Clara said. "I genuinely hope so." She found the property. The next morning, Coot driving her out in the wagon, his sister's assessment of Clara apparently having been delivered and accepted because he was more talkative than he'd been described. The property was everything the land office man had promised in the category of challenges and nothing in the category of welcome. The cabin needed everything. The garden was weeds to the fence line. The well was intact but neglected. "You sure about this?" Coot said from the wagon. "I am not sure about a single thing," Clara said, climbing down. "But I'm doing it anyway. What do I need to pay you to bring lumber tomorrow?" Coot named a price. Clara said yes. Coot looked at her with the expression his sister had worn, that recalibrating look, and drove away. Clara stood alone on the property her father had filed for in 1879, and never lived to work, and she looked at what she'd inherited, and she thought about Bernard Holt in his gray suit, and she thought about her mother's remedy book in the cedar box, and she thought about the Adler family. "All right," she said aloud to nobody. "Let's get started." She worked the way her mother had taught her, task by task. What can be done today? Done today. What can't be done today? Noted and set aside for tomorrow. She cleared the cabin interior first, which was unpleasant but finite. She checked the well, found the rope-rotted added rope to the list for Coot. She walked the fence line and found the places where it had come down and counted the posts she'd need to replace. She identified the section of the south wall where the wood had gone soft with rot and marked it with a piece of red cloth so she'd know where to start. She also found something else on the eastern edge of the property, a spring. A good one, flowing clean and cold, out of a rock outcropping that the previous owner had apparently never noticed or never cared about. Clara crouched beside it and put her hand in the water and felt the strength of the flow, and she thought about what Nora had said. Holt doesn't give up because someone tears up his paperwork, and she thought about water rights and land rights, and the way control of water in cattle country was the same as control of everything. She thought this spring matters. I need to understand exactly what it connects to and where it goes. She would think about that later. Right now she had a wall to mark and a list to write and a boarding house to get back to before dark, because she was a woman alone in territory. She didn't know yet, and she was not foolish about what that meant. She was not afraid either. There was a distinction, and it mattered. The days that followed had their own rhythm. Coot brought lumber. Clara learned through trial and significant error how to replace rotted boarding. Coot demonstrated once with the air of a man watching someone attempt something he respected even if he doubted the outcome, and Clara did it herself the second time while he watched, and by the third time he had stopped watching and was doing something else, which she took as the ranching country equivalent of a standing ovation. She replanted the garden. She restored the well. She fixed the windows 2 with real glass, 2 with boards, until she could afford glass. And every evening she came back to the boarding house and wrote in the small notebook she kept beside the cedar box, recording what she'd done, and what she'd found, and what still needed doing. The way her mother had taught her to record the land. Because land is a living thing, and living things change, and you cannot manage what you do not observe. It was on the 9th day that Roy Sutter came to the cabin door. He was a big man working with the kind of face that had absorbed a considerable amount of weather without complaint, and he was holding his left hand against his chest in a way that meant he'd been trying not to look at it for longer than he should have. "I heard you might know something about medicine," he said without preamble. "I'm one of Thornwood's men. Name's Roy." "Come in," Clara said. "Sit down." She unwrapped the hand and looked at what was underneath, and she did not let her expression change because what Roy Sutter needed right now was not to see her react to how bad it was. The wound was a wire cut deep going on 5 days old, and the infection had settled in with the comfortable confidence of something that had not been challenged. "How long?" she said. 4 days, Roy said. "Maybe 5. And you've been working on it." It wasn't a question. Roy had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Ranch doesn't stop," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Ranches don't stop and men don't either, and that's why I'm looking at a hand that came about a day away from something a lot worse than an infection." She was already working as she spoke, cleaning the wound with a solution that made Roy go rigid in his chair without making a sound which she respected. "You're going to rest this hand for 5 days. "I can't rest my hand for 5 days, Roy said. "You can," Clara said, "or you'll be resting it permanently because it won't work anymore. Those are the options." She applied the poultice, began wrapping. "Come back in 2 days. Don't get this wet. Don't use it for anything heavier than picking up a cup." Roy looked at the bandaged hand with the expression of a man conducting an internal negotiation with a decision he'd already lost. "What do I owe you?" he said. "Come back in 2 days and let me check the healing," Clara said. "We'll talk about it then." He came back. The hand was responding. He came back again. By the end of the week, the infection was clearing clean, and Roy Sutter sat at her table drinking the coffee she'd put in front of him, and looked at her with an expression she'd learned to read, the specific look of someone revising their expectations of her in real time. "You're good at this," he said. "My mother was better," Clara said, "but she taught me everything she knew." "Where is she now?" "Gone," Clara said. 3 years ago." Roy was quiet for a moment, in the decent way of men who know when not to speak. Then, "Mr. Thornwood's going to hear about this." "He already has, I suspect," Clara said. "He'll want to come thank you himself," Roy said. "That's how he is. He'll come in person or not at all." "He's welcome," Clara said, "whenever it suits him." Roy nodded. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she'd see again, she didn't know that yet, and said, "Mrs. Whitlock, I'm going to tell you something because I think you should know it before you meet him." He paused. "Mr. Thornwood is not an easy man to know. Hasn't been since his wife passed. That's going on 10 years now. He runs the ranch, he keeps to himself. He doesn't trouble people, and he's just not—" Roy stopped. Tried again. "He doesn't smile," he said finally. "I've worked for that man 6 years, and I have never once seen him smile. Not a real one. The men talk about it. New hands don't believe it until they've been there a while. But it's true." Clara looked at Roy steadily. "What happened to his wife?" she said. Roy shook his head slowly. "That's his to tell," he said. "If he ever does." Elias Thornwood came on a Thursday. Clara heard the horse first, a good horse moving at an unhurried pace that suggested both quality of animal and confidence of rider, and she was at the doorway before he reached it, which was habit from a lifetime of preferring to see visitors coming. How was not what she had constructed in her head from Roy's description, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had constructed. He was tall, solidly built, somewhere on the far side of 50, in the way that some men carry. Not declining, just arrived at the gravity of themselves. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A face that had been through considerable weather and had come out of it not softened, but settled. He wore his coat like a man who had bought it for work and used it for work which she thought said something useful. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and got down. He took his hat off. He looked at her with dark eyes that were measuring without being unkind, the look she thought of a man who had learned to assess people quickly because he'd had to. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Thornwood," she said. "My man Roy tells me you saved his hand." "His hand saved itself," Clara said. "It needed someone to treat the infection and give it a chance to heal. That's a different thing." Something moved through his expression too quickly to name not quite surprise, but adjacent to it. Like a man who had been handed a response he hadn't prepared for. "Nevertheless," he said, "I came to thank you." "I appreciate that," Clara said. He turned his hat in his hands once, a slow rotation. "And to let you know that if you need anything by way of neighborly help, you can send to the ranch." "That's generous," Clara said. "I'll keep it in mind." He put his hat back on, and he looked at the property, the way a cattleman looks at land, not at what it was, but at what was being done with it. The repaired fencing, the cleared garden beds, the straightened door. She watched him take it in. "You've done considerable work here," he said. "I have," she said. "There's considerable more to do." He nodded. A single precise nod. He was a man of few words and apparently no wasted motion, and she found herself curious about that, in the way you're curious about a lock that's more complex than the one you usually deal with. He turned to go. "Mr. Thornwood," she said. He stopped. "The fence on the eastern boundary of your north pasture," Clara said. "About 40 yards of it came down maybe 10 days ago, maybe more. You've had 8 head of cattle grazing on my property. I moved them back through the gap this morning and stacked deadfall to keep them from coming through again. I marked the spot with red cloth so your men can find it." He turned back, slowly. "You moved my cattle," he said. 8 of them, Clara said. "They were in my garden." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man recalibrating, which is a different thing. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read at all, and then so briefly she might have imagined it, except she knew she hadn't. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The memory of one. The involuntary ghost of a muscle that had forgotten it was allowed. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitlock," Elias Thornwood said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thornwood," Clara said. He rode away. Clara stood in her doorway and watched him go, and she thought about Roy's words. I have never once seen him smile. Not a real one. And she thought about that ghost of a movement at the corner of his mouth, and what it cost a man to suppress something that small. She went back inside. She had work to do. But 3 days later, when Roy came by again, not for medical reasons, she was fairly certain just because he'd taken to coming by. He said in the careful sideways manner of a man delivering information, he wasn't certain was his to deliver, "He asked about you." "Did he?" Clara said without looking up. "Twice," Roy said. "First time general, how the property was looking, whether you seemed to be managing." A pause. "Second time he asked if you'd mentioned water, or the land around the spring." Clara looked up at that. "The spring on the eastern boundary. He didn't say which spring," Roy said. "Just water, in general." Roy looked at his hat which he was holding in his lap. "I told him you'd mentioned the spring and that you seemed to know something about watershed." He got real quiet. Quiet in a different way than he's usually quiet. "What's his usual quiet?" Clara said. "Closed," Roy said. "Like a door that's latched." He considered. This was quiet like a door that's open a crack and someone's deciding whether to push it further. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Roy," she said, "you're a more observant man than you let on." "Don't go spreading that around," Roy said. "I got a reputation to maintain." The second visit from Elias Thornwood came on a Thursday evening, unusual because evening visits in cattle country meant something either urgent or deliberate, and this was clearly the latter. Clara heard the horse and opened the door and found him standing at the edge of her porch light, holding 2 cups of coffee, with the air of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it. "Roy said you drink it black," he said. "He was right," Clara said. She took one of the cups. He settled on the porch step with the ease of a man who had spent significant portions of his life on porch steps, and Clara sat in the repaired chair, and they drank coffee in a silence that was, and this was the thing she hadn't expected, easy. "The fence is repaired," he said. "The north pasture stretch." "I noticed," Clara said. "Thank you. Should have caught it sooner." A pause. "My foreman's been stretched thin. Ranch work is always more than the men available for it," Clara said. He looked out at the property, at the garden, at the second spring she'd cleared on the eastern edge, just visible in the failing light. "How did you find the spring?" "Spring," he said. "Walking the boundary," she said. "I walk every part of land I'm responsible for. You can't manage what you haven't seen." "My father said the same thing," Elias said. It came out quietly without preamble, like something said before it was fully decided. Clara didn't respond immediately. She let it sit the way you let a skittish thing settle. "Was he a rancher?" she said after a moment. "Born to it," Elias said. "Came out from Missouri in '49. Built the ranch from 40 head of cattle and a piece of land nobody else wanted." A pause. "He always said the land tells you what it needs if you listen right." "My mother said the same thing about plants," Clara said. "Same principle, different scale." Elias looked at her. Something in his face had shifted, not open exactly, but less deliberately closed. Like that door Roy had described. "You inherited this land from your father," he said. "I did," Clara said. "He filed for it in '79, never got out here to work it." "What happened to him?" "He died," Clara said, "before he could build what he meant to build." She turned her cup in her hands. "I came to finish it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, that means something is being considered. "There's a water problem," Elias said. "On the southwest pasture. The flow's been changing the last 2 seasons. My men can't figure the source of it." He looked at her directly. "Roy said you'd found something." "I have," Clara said. "The spring on my eastern boundary is redirecting subsurface flow. Probably has been for a while. The land around it shows the signs if you know what to look for. It's affecting your southwest water access." She paused. "I've drawn it out. If you want to walk the boundary on Saturday, I can show you what I found." He was quiet for a moment. "7 in the morning," he said. "I'll come at 7. "I'll be up," Clara said. He finished his coffee. He stood. He set the cup on the porch rail with a kind of precise care that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic a man who put things down where they belonged, who did not leave things approximate. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Clara," she said. "Please." He looked at her steadily. Something moved through his expression, a recalibration or a decision. "Elias," he said. He rode away in the dark. Clara sat on the porch after he was gone, holding her empty cup, and thought about Roy's words. "I have never once seen him smile." 10 years. And she thought about the door that was open a crack, and the man who had sat on her porch step and mentioned his father without meaning to, and said Elias like it was something he was remembering how to give. She thought about what it cost a person to stay closed for 10 years. What you had to do to yourself every day to maintain it. What it left behind when you finally stopped. Then she thought about Bernard Holt and the gray suit and the 6 families and the spring on the eastern boundary and what it connected to, and the fact that Samuel Bright had told her something was coming and she should be ready. She was not ready yet. But she was closer than she'd been when she arrived, and somewhere in the Thornwood house across the dark land. Elias Thornwood sat in the chair by his window and did not examine why he'd mentioned his father, and did not examine why Thursday evening had seemed like a reasonable time to bring coffee to a neighbor, and looked at the stars for a long time before going to bed. In the morning, Roy Sutter asked him at breakfast whether he should send word to Mrs. Whitlock about the Saturday timing. "Call her Clara," Elias said without looking up from his coffee. "That's what she prefers." Roy looked at his plate. He said nothing, but the edge of his mouth moved in a way he was careful to keep aimed at the floor, because 6 years of working for Elias Thornwood had taught him a great deal about which observations were worth keeping to himself. Outside, the spring ran on. The water didn't know about legal boundaries or gray-suited bankers or the precise number of years since a man had last allowed himself to feel something. It just moved the way water does, finding the lowest ground, pressing into every available space, slow and inevitable, and entirely unstoppable toward wherever there was room to go. And in the Territory Recorder's office in Helena, 60 miles north, there was a file, a land file. And in that file was a document that Bernard Holt had not yet managed to reach, the original Whitlock deed registered in 1879, signed and sealed, and entirely legal. What Holt didn't know yet was that he wasn't the only one who knew it existed. What he also didn't know was that the woman he'd tried to run off Main Street that morning had spent the evening talking to the one man in the Territory he could not afford to make an enemy of. He would find out. Men like Holt always found out. The question was, what would happen when he did? Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of morning that made Montana feel like a promise instead of a threat. Elias arrived at 7, exactly which Clara had expected, and he arrived alone, which she had also expected, because he was not a man who brought witnesses to things he hadn't decided about yet. She was already outside when he wrote up her notebook in one hand and her mother's surveying compass in the other, a battered brass instrument that had belonged to her grandfather and still ran true. Elias looked at the compass when he got down from his horse. "Your grandfather's," he said. "How did you know it wasn't mine?" Clara said. "The wear pattern," he said. "Too old for you. Too careful for someone who didn't love it." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "His. He homesteaded in Pennsylvania in 1831, mapped every inch of land he owned by hand." She put the compass in her coat pocket. "He said a person who doesn't know their own ground doesn't deserve to keep it." Elias was quiet. Then, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," Clara said. "Shall we walk?" They walked the eastern boundary for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and it was the most useful conversation Clara had had since arriving in Willow Creek. Not because they talked about personal things they didn't mostly, but because Elias Thornwood turned out to be the kind of man who listened to information the way a craftsman listens to a tool. Completely. Without commentary, until he understood what was being said. And when he did speak, what he said was worth hearing. "Show me where the secondary channel would run," he said, when Clara had finished explaining the subsurface flow problem. She pointed it out on her diagram, then walked him to the physical location and showed him the ground evidence, the way the soil had shifted, the subtle depression that marked where water had been moving underground for years. Elias crouched down and pressed his hand flat against the earth. He stayed like that for a long moment. "My father identified a spring on this boundary in 1871, he said. "Before your family filed. He always said there was more water here than we were using." "I was right," Clara said. "This spring is connected to the same aquifer that feeds your southwest pasture." When the surface expression shifted, probably during the floods of 81, it changed the distribution. She crouched beside him. "If we cut a secondary channel here and here, we redirect the surface flow back toward your pasture and stop the undermining on my eastern fence line. Both properties benefit." Elias looked at the ground, then at her diagram, then at the ground again. "You worked this out from observation alone," he said. "And my mother's books," Clara said. "She corresponded with a man in Colorado who studied underground water systems. She kept his letters. I read them probably 50 times growing up." Elias stood up slowly. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, not the closed door Roy had described, but something that was checking whether it was safe to open further. "I'll put 6 men on it Monday," he said, "with your permission to work the boundary section." "You have it," Clara said. They walked back toward the cabin, in a silence that had become over the course of the morning genuinely comfortable. At the edge of her property, Elias stopped and looked back at the spring, and Clara saw something cross his face that wasn't about water at all. "My wife loved this kind of morning," he said. It came out the way the mention of his father had come out on Thursday, before it was fully decided. Clara didn't turn to look at him. She looked at the spring instead, giving him the privacy of not being watched. "Cold and clear," she said. She said it was the only time Montana felt honest, he said. Before the heat came and everything started pretending. Clara thought about that. "She sounds like she saw things clearly," she said. "She did," Elias said. "Better than anyone I've known." A pause. Long enough that Clara thought he was done. Then, "She's been gone 10 years this November." "I know," Clara said quietly. "Roy told me. Not the details. Just that she was gone." He nodded. Once. The conversation closed like a book being set down gently, not shut hard, and they walked the rest of the way to the cabin without speaking, and it was all right. What was not all right was what Clara found nailed to her cabin door. It was a piece of paper, folded once, and when she unfolded it, the words were short and unambiguous. "Leave while you still have a choice. This is your only warning." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Clara stood reading it a second time, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because she was deciding how she felt about it, which turned out to be more angry than afraid, which she thought was probably the right proportion. "What is that?" Elias said from just behind her. She handed it to him without speaking. He read it. His face didn't change exactly, but something in it went very still in the way that still things go when they are doing considerable work beneath the surface. He folded the paper. He held it for a moment. "Holt," he said. It wasn't a question. "Most likely," Clara said. "Or someone he pays." "Has he done anything else?" Elias said. "Since the incident on Main Street." Clara considered how much to say. She decided on the truth because she was not in the habit of editing information that other people needed. "Samuel Bright told me Holt has relationships with the county assessor and a territorial circuit judge," she said, "and that he's run this same scheme at least twice before possibly 6 times. The Adler family lost their property 3 weeks after refusing him." Elias was quiet for a moment that felt like it had weight to it. "I know the Adlers," he said. "They're working Henderson's place now, east of town." "I know," Clara said. "Dora told me." He looked at the folded paper in his hand. Then he looked at Clara. "Do you intend to stay?" he said. Not challenging. Just asking the way a man asks a question he needs a real answer to. "Mr. Thornwood," Clara said. "Elias, I tore up his paperwork in the middle of Main Street 4 days ago. If I leave now, I've handed him exactly what he wanted and taught him that the tactic works." She held his gaze. "I'm not leaving." Something happened in his face. It was brief, and it was not a smile, but it was the closest thing to approval she'd seen from him, and it landed somewhere in her chest with more weight than she would have expected. "All right," he said. He put the paper in his coat pocket. "I'm going to keep this, in case it becomes evidence." "Samuel Bright will want to know about it," Clara said. "I'll tell him," Elias said. "I need to talk to Samuel anyway." He put his hat on. "Lock your door at night, Clara. And if anything else appears on your property that shouldn't be there, send Roy to me, immediately." "I'm not looking for," she started. "I know you're not looking for protection," Elias said. "I'm not offering it as charity. I'm offering it as a neighbor with a significant interest in what happens to the land on my boundary and the person working it." He paused. "Bernard Holt is not just your problem. He has been a problem in this territory for 3 years, and I have let it go on longer than I should have because it wasn't on my land." He said it like a man stating something he wasn't proud of. "It's on my land now." Clara looked at him steadily. "Because I'm your neighbor," she said. "Yes," he said. And then after a pause that was just long enough to mean something, among other reasons. He rode away. Clara went inside and locked the door, and she stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment and thought about those words among other reasons and what they might mean from a man who chose his words the way he chose everything else carefully and only when he meant them. Then she put a pot of water on for tea and sat down at her table and wrote everything she'd observed about the spring in her notebook, because the spring was real and mappable, and she could do something about it. And the thing happening in her chest, when Elias Thornwood said, among other reasons, was neither real nor mappable, and she was not ready to look at it yet. The Monday work crew arrived as promised. 6 of Elias's men with tools and timber, and the efficient, wordless coordination of people who had worked together long enough to not need to explain themselves. Roy was among them, and he came to the cabin door first thing and handed Clara a note in Elias's handwriting that said, "These men are yours to direct. Tell them what you need." And underneath, in slightly smaller writing, "I'll come by this evening if that's acceptable." Clara wrote back on the same paper, "It is. Bring coffee if you want. I'll have biscuits." Roy delivered it back to the ranch and returned with the information that Elias had read it and said nothing, but had by Roy's account gone directly to the kitchen to speak to the cook. The men worked for 3 days on the channel. Clara directed them from the diagram she'd drawn, and they did what she said, without the particular kind of hesitation. She'd been braced for the hesitation that meant a woman's instruction was being internally converted into a man's suggestion before being acted on. She thought that probably said something about Elias, that his men were capable of taking direction from whoever actually knew what needed doing. Elias came by the first evening as promised, and the second and the third. He brought coffee the first night and stayed 2 hours. The second night he brought coffee and a piece of information he had spoken to Samuel Bright, and Samuel had sent a telegraph to Helena, requesting a verification copy of the Whitlock deed from the Territorial Records Office. "As a precaution," Elias said, "so we have an authenticated copy on hand if Holt tries anything procedural." "You said we," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "I did," he said. The third evening he arrived later than the previous 2, and Clara knew from the set of his shoulders when he came up the porch steps that something had happened. "Sit down," she said before he could speak. He sat. She put coffee in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the way people do when they need something to hold on to, and Clara sat across from him and waited. "The Kellerman family," he said. "West of town, 3 miles. They got a visit from Holt today." He paused. "Different paperwork this time. He's claiming a surveying error that puts their western pasture inside the boundaries of a property he holds title to." "Does he hold title to it?" Clara said. "Nobody can find the filing," Elias said. "Samuel's looking, but Holt has a document that looks legal and a clerk who will testify the filing exists." He set the cup down. "The Kellermans have 4 children. The oldest is 12. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many families is he doing this to at once?" "We don't know," Elias said. "That's the problem. Every case has been isolated. Every family thought they were the only one. Nobody put it together until—" He stopped. "Until someone made enough noise on Main Street that people started talking to each other," Clara said. "Yes," Elias said. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the Adlers working Henderson's land. She thought about the Kellermans with 4 children and a western pasture they were about to lose. She thought about the note on her door, "Leave while you still have a choice," and what it meant that Holt was escalating at the same time he was expanding, which meant he was not worried about being stopped. "He thinks he's untouchable," she said. "He has been," Elias said. "He hasn't been challenged simultaneously on multiple fronts," Clara said. "He's been dealing with one family at a time, which keeps each family isolated and makes each case look like an individual dispute rather than a pattern." She looked up at Elias. "What happens if the affected families talk to each other formally, with Samuel Bright present to document the pattern?" Elias looked at her. That door again. Open a little further than it had been. "You're talking about building a legal case," he said. "I'm talking about making visible what he's been keeping invisible," Clara said. "The scheme only works if every family thinks they're alone and outmatched. If they understand they're not alone, and if the pattern is documented, the territorial court can't dismiss it as a local dispute." "That takes time," Elias said. "Yes," Clara said. "And while it's being built, he's going to keep pressuring people, which means we need to give the families being pressured enough support to hold on." She paused. "What does Holt need to make a fraudulent claim stick, a compliant local official, a document that looks legitimate, and a family too frightened or too isolated to fight back. Take away any one of those, Elias said slowly, and the claim falls apart. He can manufacture documents, Clara said. He already has a clerk, but local officials are a different matter. Who is the county assessor? A man named Price, Elias said. Vernon Price. He's been assessor for 7 years. He and Holt... He paused. They have an arrangement. Is Price afraid of Holt or paid by him? Clara said. Elias looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the recalibrating look, not the carefully closed door. Something rawer than either of those. You're the first person who's asked that, he said. Everyone else just says they have an arrangement and moves on. Because the answer matters, Clara said. If Price is afraid, he can be reassured. If he's paid, he needs to be replaced. I don't know which it is, Elias said. Not for certain. Then that's the first thing to find out, Clara said. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the spring, like something he'd seen before, but hadn't understood the full significance of until now. Clara, he said, when Holt figures out that you're doing more than just staying on your property, he already knows I'm a problem, Clara said. He left me a note about it. The question is whether I'm a small problem he can deal with quietly, or a large enough problem that dealing with me causes more trouble than leaving me alone. She held his gaze. The way to become the second kind of problem is to not be alone. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he said in a tone she hadn't heard from him before, quieter and without the careful management that usually shaped his speech, I should have done this 3 years ago. You didn't have a reason to yet, Clara said. That's not an excuse, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's a fact, and facts are more useful than guilt. She picked up her coffee. What's done is done. What matters is what happens from here. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that Clara became aware of it as a moment, not just a pause, but a beat of something, a breath taken deliberately. You're remarkable, Elias Thornwood said, quietly, without apparent intention to say it. Clara felt the words land somewhere she hadn't prepared for. She looked at her coffee cup. I'm practical, she said. That's all. Clara, he said, look at me. She looked at him. I have been called many things in this territory, Elias said. Practical is not one of them. I know what practical looks like. His eyes were direct and steady and entirely serious. What you're doing is not practical. What you're doing is courageous. There is a difference, and you deserve to have someone say it to you plainly. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like water, and the spring ran on in the dark. Thank you, Clara said. She said it carefully because her voice was doing something she didn't want it to do. Elias nodded. He stood. He put his hat on with that precise habitual motion. I'm going to talk to the Kellermans tomorrow, he said. Will you come? She looked up at him. Yes, she said. They went to the Kellermans the next morning. It was not a comfortable visit. Frank Kellerman was a man in his mid-40s who had built his property with his own hands over 14 years, and he was sitting at his kitchen table with the specific posture of a man trying to hold himself together by sheer will and not entirely succeeding. His wife June stood at the stove with her back to the room, and Clara could see from the set of her shoulders that June Kellerman had been crying and had decided that nobody was going to see her do it again. They're saying the western fence line is wrong, Frank said. That a survey from 1878 shows the boundary 50 yards east of where we put it. That 50 yards is where our main water tank is. Can we see the document? Clara said. Frank pushed it across the table. Clara and Elias looked at it together. It was well made, better than the one Holt had tried on Clara. The territorial seal looked right. The surveyor's signature looked right. The date and the filing reference looked right. Samuel Bright needs to see this, Clara said. Samuel Bright's already seen it, Frank said. He says it might be legitimate. He says he can't tell for certain without comparing it to the original survey records, which are in Helena. He looked at Elias. Mr. Thornwood, I have 3 weeks before Holt says he'll file for enforcement. If the boundary moves, I lose the water tank. Without the water tank. He stopped. He pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment. My cattle can't survive the summer without that tank. The original survey records are in Helena, Clara said. How long to get them? 2 weeks maybe, Elias said. If we send someone today. Send someone today, Clara said. She turned to Frank. Mr. Kellerman, has Holt spoken to you directly or through someone else? A man named Crane, Frank said. Works for Holt. Comes around dressed like a lawyer, but Samuel says he's not one. What has Crane told you your options are? Clara said. Frank looked at his hands. Sign over the 50 yards in question to a holding company Holt controls, he said, in exchange for what Crane calls a settlement payment, enough to build a new water tank. A pause. On the east side, where there's no water. He's offering you money to accept a theft, Clara said. June Kellerman turned around from the stove. Her eyes were red, but her voice was level. That's exactly what it is, she said. My husband knows it. We're not stupid people. We know what it is. She looked at Clara directly. What I want to know, ma'am, is whether knowing what it is means we can stop it. Clara looked at June Kellerman, and she thought about her mother the way her mother used to face things straight on, without flinching, with the particular dignity of someone who had learned that the only thing worse than facing a hard thing was looking away from it. Not alone, Clara said. But you're not alone. She looked at Frank, then back at June. You need to know that the Adler family went through something similar, and at least 4 other families in this territory. Holt has been running the same scheme for 3 years, and the reason it's worked is that every family has faced it in isolation. She paused. If the affected families can be brought together formally with Samuel Bright to document the pattern, we can take this to the territorial court as a coordinated fraud case, not a series of individual disputes. A judge can dismiss one family's claim. He cannot dismiss 6. Frank and June looked at each other. Something passed between them in the way of people who have had a long marriage and have learned to communicate in the shorthand of shared history. Who else has he done this to? Frank said. I know of the Adlers, Clara said. I'm going to find out who else. Give me a week. She and Elias rode back toward her property, in a silence that had a different texture than the silence they'd been building between them over the past days. Less careful, more charged like air before a storm decides what it's going to do. You told them a week, Elias said. I have a week, Clara said. Do you know how to find the other families? He said. Dora Finch knows everything about everyone in this territory, Clara said. She just needed someone to ask her the right questions. I'm going to ask her tonight. Elias was quiet for a moment. There's something else you need to know, he said. She looked at him. His voice had changed. Not the careful management, or the quiet warmth she'd been hearing, more of something more serious than either. I had a conversation with a man in town yesterday, Elias said. A man who works at the assay office. He told me that 6 months ago Holt filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office on a piece of property described in the filing as the Whitlock Parcel Eastern Half, including water rights to all springs and secondary channels. He stopped. Clara stopped her horse. He filed on my spring, she said. 6 months ago, before I arrived. Before you arrived, Elias said. The quiet that followed was not peaceful. It was the quiet of something clicking into place. A picture assembling itself from pieces that had seemed separate until the moment they weren't. He knew I was coming, Clara said. He knew the property was going to be claimed. He filed on the spring before I could arrive and establish occupancy, so that when I got here the water rights would already be contested. She looked at Elias. The deed he tried to get me to sign on Main Street wasn't just trying to take the land. He was trying to cut off the legal challenge before I understood there was one. If you'd signed it, Elias said carefully, you would have transferred the property, including all disputed water claims. Meaning his filing on the spring would have become uncontested. Because I wouldn't have had standing to contest it anymore, Clara said. Yes, Elias said. She sat with that for a full moment. Then she said, How did he know I was coming? Elias met her eyes. Someone told him, he said. Someone who knew about the inheritance before you arrived. The land office, Clara said. Gerald Potts. Possibly, Elias said. Or someone who had access to the probate records in... He paused. Where was your father's estate settled? Billings, Clara said. There was a lawyer. My father's lawyer, a man named Aldous Fry. Elias said nothing. He didn't have to. Clara felt something cold settle into the center of her chest that wasn't fear and wasn't anger, but was the thing that lives just under both of them. The specific clarifying chill of understanding that what you've been dealing with is larger and more deliberate than you knew. He had someone in Billings, she said, monitoring probate filings, looking for properties with single female inheritors who might be persuadable. She paused. He set this up before I knew my father was dead. That's what it looks like, Elias said. That means he's been doing the same thing with other properties, she said. Not just waiting for opportunities, manufacturing them, finding vulnerable filings and moving in before the inheritors can establish themselves. Elias looked at her steadily. Clara, he said, this is bigger than one man and one scheme. If what you're saying is right, he has people watching probate courts. Possibly more than one territory. Then we need more than Samuel Bright and a trip to Helena, Clara said. Yes, Elias said. We do. She looked at him. Something passed between them, not the careful warmth of coffee on porch steps, or the shared focus of walking a water boundary, but something more urgent and more equal. The look of two people who have arrived at the same conclusion about the same serious thing and are deciding together what to do about it. I know a man in Helena, Elias said. A federal land agent. His name is Carson Webb. He's been trying to build a case against land fraud in the territory for 2 years. He paused. He's going to want to talk to you. Tell him I'm ready, Clara said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than any of the ones before, purposeful and shared and pointing forward. That evening, Clara went to Dora Finch and asked her questions. Dora answered them the way she answered most things, directly and completely, and without requiring an explanation of why she was being asked. By the end of the evening, Clara had names. 7 families, not 6. 7 families across 3 counties who had received visits from a man named Crane, or a man matching Holt's description, with documents that looked legitimate, and timelines that felt urgent, and options that weren't really options. She wrote every name down in her notebook, with the date of contact, the nature of the claim, and the current status of each family. Then she sat back and looked at what she'd written. 7 families, 3 years, a network of contacts in at least 2 probate courts, a compliant county assessor, a territorial circuit judge with an arrangement, a clerk who would testify to filings that may not exist, a man named Crane who dressed like a lawyer and wasn't one, and a spring on her eastern boundary that Holt had filed on 6 months before she arrived because someone in Billings had been watching for exactly the right kind of vulnerable, distant female inheritor to come along. Clara put her pen down. She looked at the cedar box on the nightstand. She thought about her father, who had filed for this land in 1879 with $40 and a belief that the West was wide enough for people who were willing to work for what they wanted. She thought about Bernard Holt in his gray suit and what he had built his certainty on. He had built it on people being alone, on people being afraid, on people looking at what he was offering them, the illusion of a choice, and not seeing that the choice was a trap. She had been alone when she got off that stagecoach. She was not alone anymore. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and began writing. Not observations this time. A strategy. Everything she knew in order with the connections between them, laid out the way her grandfather had laid out land precisely, and with a clear understanding of where each boundary ran and what it was protecting. She was still writing when the lamp oil ran low and the town outside went quiet, and she didn't stop until she had written everything she knew and everything she needed to find out, and everything that needed to happen, and what she was left with was not comfort exactly, but something better. Clarity. Tomorrow she would send word to Elias. Tomorrow she would contact Samuel Bright. Tomorrow she would begin making this visible. Tonight. The spring ran in the dark and in the assay office on the far side of town. A file with her name on it sat in a cabinet, and somewhere in his house, Bernard Holt was deciding what to do about the woman who had torn up his paperwork in the middle of Main Street and still hadn't left. He should have paid more attention to why she hadn't left. He should have asked himself what kind of woman comes, 1,100 miles alone to claim a piece of difficult land, and tears up a banker's document in front of a crowd, and locks her door at night, and keeps writing in a notebook. He hadn't asked. He would. But by the time he understood the full answer to that question, it was going to be too late to use it. Carson Webb arrived in Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning, and he arrived quietly, which was the first thing Clara noticed about him. No announcement, no official introduction, no territorial seal on the side of a wagon. He came in on the stage, like an ordinary traveler carrying one bag and wearing the kind of coat that didn't announce anything about who he was, and he went directly to Dora Finch's boarding house and asked for a room, and the only reason Clara knew he'd arrived at all was that Elias had sent Roy to her cabin at 6 in the morning with a note that said, "He's here. Come to town at 9. Bring the notebook." She brought 2 notebooks, the one with the family records and the one with the strategy she'd written out the night the lamp oil ran low. Carson Webb was a lean man in his mid-40s with a quiet face and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent a long time listening for things other people miss. He shook Clara's hand when Elias introduced them, and he shook it like a person shaking another person's hand. Not the cautious, minimal version men sometimes offered women, but a real handshake which she noted and appreciated. "Mr. Thornwood tells me you've been building a picture," Webb said. They were in Dora's sitting room, which Dora had vacated with the efficiency of a woman who knew when to be elsewhere. "I'd like to see it." Clara put both notebooks on the table. She opened the first one to the family records page and turned it so Webb could read it without craning. 7 families, she said. 3 counties. The earliest I can document is 3 years ago, but Dora Finch believes the first case may go back further. The pattern is consistent. A document that looks legitimate: survey dispute tax lion probate error. A man named Crane who presents it. A short timeline for compliance. And an option that looks like a settlement, but is actually a transfer. Webb looked at the list for a long time without speaking. He turned to the second page where Clara had written the connections: the county assessor, the circuit judge, the clerk, the probate monitoring. He read that page more slowly. "The Billings connection," he said. "How confident are you in that?" "Confident enough to have written to my father's lawyer for confirmation," Clara said. "I sent the letter 4 days ago, but I don't need his response to know it's true, because Holt filed on my spring 6 months before I arrived. Nobody in Willow Creek knew I was coming. The only people who knew were connected to my father's probate." Webb looked at Elias. Elias said nothing, which was one of the things Clara had come to understand about him. He didn't fill silences with words when the silence was already saying something. "I've been trying to build this case for 2 years, Webb said. "I have fragments, complaints from families who were too frightened to formalize them. A pattern I could see but couldn't prove, because every piece was isolated." He looked at Clara's notebook again. "You've done in 3 weeks what I haven't managed in 2 years. "I had an advantage," Clara said. "What advantage?" Webb said. "I was a target," she said. "He tried it on me directly. That meant I understood from the inside what he was doing and why it worked, which is harder to see from the outside." Webb nodded slowly. "I need to meet the families," he said. "All 7. Separately if they prefer, together if they'll agree to it." "I'll arrange it," Clara said. "Give me 2 days." She arranged it in 1. Dora Finch helped, because Dora Finch had the social architecture of the entire territory mapped in her head, and knew which families needed to hear from Clara directly, and which needed to hear from a neighbor they already trusted. By Thursday afternoon, 6 of the 7 families had agreed to meet. The 7th, a man named Greer, who had already lost his property and left the territory, was unreachable, but his wife had stayed behind with her sister in town, and she came. They met at the Kellerman place because it was large enough, and because Frank and June had said yes without hesitation. 9 adults around the Kellerman's kitchen table with Samuel Bright at one end, taking notes, and Carson Webb at the other listening, and Clara standing. Because there wasn't enough room to sit, and she was too focused to sit anyway. What happened at that table was the thing that happens when isolated people discover they are not isolated. It started slowly, cautious, guarded, everyone waiting to see if the others were real, or if this was somehow another trap. And then Frank Kellerman said the name Crane, and the woman from the Adler family said, "That's the same man, that's the exact same man. He told us the same thing about the timeline. And something in the room shifted like a door swinging open, and after that, nobody was guarded anymore. They talked for 3 hours. Samuel Bright filled 14 pages. Clara watched and listened and spoke only when she needed to clarify something, because this was not her story to tell. It was theirs, and the most important thing right now was that they were telling it together in the same room to a federal land agent who was writing it down. When it was over, Webb closed his own notebook and looked around the table. "What you've given me today," he said, "is a coordinated fraud case, not a series of individual disputes. A coordinated, premeditated scheme, operating across multiple counties, using falsified documents, judicial corruption, and probate court infiltration." He paused. "That is a federal matter, which means I can take it above the territorial court." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then June Kellerman said, "What does that mean for our land?" "It means," Webb said, "that any property transfers completed under fraudulent pretenses can be reversed. Any claims currently pending can be suspended pending investigation." He looked at her directly. "It means that if we build this correctly, you don't just stop him. You get back what was taken." The woman from the Adler family. Her name was Ruth. Clara had learned, and she had a way of sitting very still when she was trying not to cry, put both hands flat on the table. "The Adlers," she said. "My husband's family, their property." "Is first on my list," Webb said. Ruth Adler nodded once precisely. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. On the ride back to Clara's property that evening, Elias was quieter than usual, and the quality of his quiet was different inward, the way a man gets when something is working on him below the surface. Clara rode beside him and didn't push it because she had learned by now that Elias processed things at his own pace and that the pace was worth waiting for. They were almost to her property line when he spoke. "My wife," he said. Clara didn't say anything. She just listened. "Her name was Margaret," Elias said. "She died in November of 1875. It was an accident with a wagon. A wheel came off on the north road going too fast downhill. She was alone. By the time anyone found her..." He stopped. A breath. "She was gone before I could get to her." "I'm sorry," Clara said, quietly. Because she meant it, and because it was what needed saying. "What I never told anyone," Elias said, and his voice had changed, stripped of the management raw in the way voices get when they're saying a thing for the first time, "is that I was supposed to drive her that morning. She asked me to take her to the Hendersons' place, and I said I had fence work that couldn't wait. I said she could take the wagon herself. She'd done it 100 times. He stopped again. "I chose fence work, and she took the wagon alone, and the wheel came off going downhill on the north road, and I never..." His voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough. "I never got to tell her I was wrong to send her alone." Clara let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "Elias." He looked at her. "Fence work that couldn't wait," she said. "Wheels that fail without warning. A road you'd both driven 100 times. None of those things are the same as choosing to hurt her." "I know that," he said. "I've known it for years. Samuel told me. Roy told me. The preacher told me 3 times. He looked forward again. "Knowing it and living past it are different things." "Yes," Clara said. "They are." He looked at her sharply as if he'd expected argument and gotten agreement instead. "Guilt doesn't respond to logic," Clara said. "It responds to time and to grace, which is different from logic. You can know you're not responsible and still need to forgive yourself, and those are 2 separate processes that happen at 2 separate speeds." She paused. "My mother spent 5 years blaming herself for my father's first heart attack. She'd asked him. She knew. She knew she hadn't caused it. But knowing didn't reach the part of her that needed to believe it." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "What helped her?" he said. "Stopping the performing of it," Clara said. She'd been carrying the guilt so long it had become a kind of loyalty to him. Like if she stopped feeling responsible, she'd lose the connection. A pause. She had to learn that loving him and forgiving herself weren't the same thing, that she could do both. They had stopped their horses without noticing. They were at the edge of Clara's property, where the fence line met the road, and the last light was going golden behind the hills, and Elias Thornwood was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the carefully managed steadiness. Not the door slightly ajar, but something completely unguarded and completely open. Like a man who had been holding his breath for 10 years, and had just without planning it, exhaled. "How did you know that?" he said. "It came out rough." "Because I watched her find her way through it," Clara said. "And because I've had to find my own way through things too, and the process looks the same from the inside, regardless of what the specific grief is." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving through his face that she didn't have a word for, not just emotion, but the release of something held very tight for a very long time. The way a fist opens slowly, when it's been clenched so long, the muscles have forgotten another position. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I haven't spoken about Margaret to anyone in 9 years," he said. "Not really. Not the real part of it." He paused. "I told you in 5 minutes. Sometimes the right moment finds you whether you're ready for it or not," Clara said. He looked away. He looked at the property, her cabin, her garden, the spring she'd cleared. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man seeing something he's been looking at for a while, and only now understanding what he's seeing. "I owe you an honesty," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Clara said. "I do," he said. He looked back at her. "When Roy first told me about you, the woman on the Whitlock parcel, treating ranch hands moving cattle out of her garden, I came to see you because I wanted to assess whether you were going to be a problem, whether a lone woman on that land was going to create complications I'd have to manage." He said it plainly without softening it. "That's why I came the first time." Clara held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I suspected as much. And then you told me about the cattle," he said. "And something happened that I didn't expect and haven't been able to fully account for since." The corner of his mouth moved that same ghost of movement she'd seen the first day. "I wanted to come back. Not to assess. Just to come back." The evening was very still. The spring ran its quiet sound somewhere on the eastern edge of the property. "Elias," Clara said carefully, "I have to say something to you, and I need you to hear it plainly." "Say it," he said. "I am not a woman who needs saving," she said. "I don't need a protector, or a benefactor, or someone to solve the Holt problem on my behalf. I am capable of standing on my own land and fighting for it myself, and I intend to." She held his eyes. "But I am also a woman who has spent her entire life being valued for what she could do, rather than who she is. And I need you to be honest with me and with yourself about which of those things is drawing you back here." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Elias took his hat off. He turned it in his hands, that deliberate rotation she'd come to know. Then he looked at her with a directness that left no room for misreading. "You challenge me," he said. "Every time I speak with you, you say something that goes somewhere I didn't expect, and I have to think differently about something I thought I already understood. You mapped my water problem better than my own men in a morning. You built a fraud case in 3 weeks that a federal agent couldn't build in 2 years. You told a man with a gun to drag you out by force." He paused. "I have been around capable people my entire life, Clara. I know what capable looks like. What you are is something else." "What am I?" she said. "Someone I want to know," he said simply. "Not what you can do, who you are." He held her gaze. "Is that an acceptable answer?" Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not a crack in a wall, because she hadn't built walls the way Elias had, but a kind of settling like ground that's been uncertain and suddenly finds its level. "Yes," she said. "That's an acceptable answer." He put his hat back on. "Good," he said. And then so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "I think Margaret would have liked you." Clara felt that land somewhere deep. "I think I would have liked her," she said. He nodded. "Once." Then he rode toward home, and Clara stood at her property line and watched him go, and thought that grief and grace were indeed 2 separate things that moved at 2 separate speeds, and that sometimes the person who helps you find one helps you find the other, and that she had not come to Montana looking for any of this, and could not now imagine arriving and finding anything less. What happened 3 days later hit like a winter storm that forecasters had missed entirely. Roy came to her cabin before dawn riding hard, and he knocked with the urgency of a man who had been told to get there fast. Clara opened the door before he'd knocked twice, because she'd heard the horse, and something in the sound of it had woken her fully in the way that certain sounds do. "There's a problem," Roy said. "Mr. Thornwood needs you at the ranch, now." "What kind of problem?" Clara said. "The kind with a badge on it," Roy said. She dressed in 2 minutes and rode with Roy to the Thornwood Ranch, and what she found there was a man she hadn't met, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a county assessor's badge, and 2 men behind him who were carrying the kind of papers that men carry when they want their authority to be visible before their words are. Vernon Price, the county assessor. The man Elias had described as having an arrangement with Holt. Elias was standing on his porch with the stillness that she had come to recognize as controlled fury, the stillness of a man who is very angry and has decided to express none of it until he understands exactly what he is dealing with. "What is this?" Clara said, coming up the porch steps. Price looked at her with the particular disdain of a man who has decided she is an inconvenience. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am. Everything on this property concerns her," Elias said. His voice was level. "Say what you came to say." Price unfolded a document. "By order of the county assessor's office," he said, in the rehearsed tone of a man reading something he'd been given. "This property is hereby flagged for a tax assessment audit, due to irregularities in the filing records for the years 1880 through 1884. The Thornwood Ranch is subject to a back assessment totaling." He paused in the way of a man timing his effect. $14,000. The number landed in the morning air like a stone in water. $14,000. Clara watched Elias's face. It didn't move, not one muscle. But his hands at his sides went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. "That assessment," Elias said, "is fraudulent." "The county assessor's office has determined," Price started. "The county assessor's office," Elias said, cutting him off with the precision of a man who has decided he is done being polite, "is operated by a man who has a documented financial arrangement with Bernard Holt. And I want you to know, Mr. Price, that I said documented deliberately, because it is." Price's rehearsed composure flickered, just slightly. "I don't know what you think I think," Elias said, "that Holt found out about the meeting at the Kellerman place. I think he found out that a federal land agent is now involved. And I think this," he nodded at the document in Price's hand, "is the response, not a real assessment, a pressure tactic. Because he can't get to Clara's land directly anymore, and he can't get to the Kellermans directly anymore, so he's coming at the largest property adjacent to all of it." He looked at Price steadily. "He's coming at me." Price said nothing. "Mr. Price," Clara said. He looked at her with that disdain again, and Clara held it without flinching, because she had been looked at with disdain by people considerably more practiced at it than Vernon Price. "Carson Webb arrived in Willow Creek on Tuesday," she said. "He is a federal land agent. He has now spoken with 7 families and taken formal statements from all of them. He is building a case of coordinated territorial land fraud." She paused. "He is also, as of yesterday, aware of your name and your office's involvement in at least 2 of the fraudulent property transfers. He asked me specifically to confirm whether the relationship between your office and Bernard Holt was financial or coercive." She held Price's eyes. "I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I'd find out." The blood drained from Price's face so completely that it was almost clinical to watch. "You're involved in this whether you chose it or were forced into it," Clara said. "But the distinction matters legally and in terms of what happens to you when this reaches the federal level. Men who cooperate with federal investigators receive different treatment than men who don't." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "So I'll ask you directly, Mr. Price. Which is it? Is Holt paying you, or is he threatening you?" The 2 men behind Price looked at each other. Price looked at the document in his hand. He looked at it for a long time. "I have a wife," he said. Not as an excuse, as a fact delivered by a man who was trying to explain a choice he knew was wrong to people who deserved to understand why he'd made it. "I know," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to be brave, Mr. Price. I'm asking you to be smart, because the alternative to cooperating with Carson Webb is being named as a primary co-conspirator in a federal fraud case. And that is a future your wife does not deserve either." Price folded the document. He folded it very carefully, the way you fold something you've decided not to use. He looked at Elias. "I'll need to speak to the federal agent," he said. "I'll arrange it," Clara said. "Today." Price left. His two men followed him. The morning was very quiet, in the way that follows something loud even when the loud thing was never shouted. Elias looked at Clara. "You knew he was being coerced," he said. "I suspected it from the way Samuel described the arrangement," Clara said. "Men who are paid don't look frightened when they're named. Men who are threatened do." She looked at the road where Price's wagon was disappearing. "He's scared, not corrupt. There's a difference." "You gave him a way out," Elias said. "I gave him a reason to take the way out that was already there," Clara said. "He knew it was wrong. He just needed to believe that cooperating was survivable." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "That's the second time you've done that," he said. "Found the version of a person who wants to do the right thing and spoken to that version instead of the version that's failing." "It's what my mother did," Clara said. "She said everyone has a version of themselves they'd rather be. The trick is finding it before the other version does all the damage." He held her gaze. Something in his face was different from how it had been even yesterday. More open, less managed. The way a person looks when they've decided something without quite announcing the decision. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee. We need to plan the next step before Holt figures out that Price just folded." They had 48 hours was Clara's estimate. Maybe less. Holt would learn about Price. He would learn about Webb. He would understand that the pressure tactics had failed and that the case being built against him was now large enough and federal enough that he couldn't dismiss it with a compliant local judge. Which meant he would stop using legal instruments and start using other ones. She was right, and it took him less than 48 hours. The fire started at the Kellerman place at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the meeting in their kitchen. It caught the barn first fast, too fast for accident, the kind of fast that means accelerant, and by the time the nearest neighbors saw the light and rode over the barn, was gone. Nobody was hurt. Frank had gotten his family and animals out in time. But he stood in front of what was left of the structure at 4 in the morning, with June beside him, and her hand in his, and his face set in the expression of a man who has been pushed to the last wall, and is deciding whether to fall into it or push back. Clara arrived 30 minutes after Roy came for her. Elias was already there. Frank looked at Clara when she came across the yard. "He burned my barn," he said, not asking, not accusing anyone who wasn't there to hear it. Just saying it the way you say a thing when you need to make it real by speaking it. "I know," Clara said. "My children were in that house," Frank said, 20 feet from that barn. "I know," Clara said again. "I want to fight," Frank said. "I am telling you right now, whatever you and Mr. Thornwood and that federal man are doing, I want to be part of it. I am done being afraid of Bernard Holt." Clara looked at him steadily. "Then come with me," she said. "Tomorrow morning, there's something you need to see." What she had found, what had been waiting in the notebook she'd been keeping since the night the lamp oil ran low. Was this Holt's filing on her spring, 6 months before her arrival, referenced a surveying record. A specific one, filed in 1877 with the Territorial Land Office and signed by a surveyor named Reeves. The same surveyor whose signature appeared on the document Holt had shown the Kellermans. And on one of the documents, Samuel Bright had pulled from the Adler file. And when Webb checked on 2 more documents from 2 other affected families, the same surveyor, the same signature, 5 different documents, 5 different properties, 5 different years. Except Webb had confirmed with the Territorial Records Office in Helena that J. Reeves surveyor had died in 1874. 3 years before the first document bearing his signature was filed. A dead man's signature. On 5 documents, filed across 3 years and 3 counties as evidence of legitimate surveys. Webb brought the confirmation to Clara's cabin on a morning that felt different from the ones before. It charged the way air feels when the weather is about to commit to something. He put the confirmation telegram on her table, and she read it, and then she put it down and looked out the window and breathed for a moment. "This is it," she said. "This is it," Webb agreed. A forged signature from a dead surveyor is not a technicality. It's not a disputed filing or a competing interpretation. It is a clear, documentable, provable fraud. And it appears on 5 separate documents that Holt has used across 3 years to steal property from 7 families. He paused. "I can take this to a federal judge today." "Do it," Clara said. "I need one more thing," Webb said. "I need someone to testify to the chain of discovery, the spring filing, the surveyor connection, how it was found and what it means. Someone who can explain the pattern to a judge in language that makes it unmistakable." He looked at her. "I need you." Clara looked at the telegram on her table. She thought about Bernard Holt on Main Street with his gray suit and his fraudulent deed and his absolute certainty that she would fold under the weight of his authority. She thought about the Adler family and the Kellermans and Frank standing in front of his burned barn at 4 in the morning. She thought about Ruth Adler with her hands flat on the table. "When?" she said. 3 days, Webb said. "The circuit judge for the federal district will be in Billings. We ride Thursday." She told Elias that evening. He was at her cabin when she got back, sitting on the porch step with coffee already made, which had become so gradually she couldn't have said exactly when it started, simply how things were between them in the evenings. He listened to everything. He didn't interrupt. And when she finished, he said, "I'm riding with you to Billings." "You don't have to," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I'm riding with you." She looked at him. In the long light of the evening, with the coffee cooling in her hands and the spring running its quiet sound behind them, she could see something in his face that had not been there when she arrived in Willow Creek. Something open and present and entirely unguarded. The face of a man who had stopped performing the version of himself that grief had made and was slowly and carefully finding his way back to whoever he'd been before it took him. She thought about what he'd said on the road. "I think Margaret would have liked you." She thought about what she'd said back. "I think I would have liked her." She thought about love as something that doesn't replace what was lost, but grows in the same ground, the way a spring finds a new outlet when the old one closes, not forcing, not erasing, just finding where there's room to go. "All right," she said. "We ride Thursday." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out at the property, at everything she'd built in the weeks since she arrived with nothing but a cedar box and a worn travel bag and a piece of land her father had never gotten to work. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "Whatever happens in Billings," he said, "I want you to know something." He looked at her directly the way he said things when he'd decided they needed saying. "I haven't felt like myself in 10 years. I've been running a ranch and keeping agreements and managing everything that needed managing, but the man doing it." He paused. He wasn't all the way present. He was just functioning. A breath. "The last 3 weeks are the first time in 10 years that I have felt actually completely present in my own life." Clara held his gaze. "You did that," he said. "I don't know how. I'm not certain it's a thing you did on purpose, but you did it." "I didn't do anything," Clara said softly. "You did. You let yourself." Something crossed his face, a small, quick, entirely unguarded movement of the muscles around his mouth and eyes. Not the ghost she'd seen before. Not the suppressed almost. Something real and warm and entirely present. For the first time in 10 years, Elias Thornwood smiled. It lasted only a moment. He seemed not to be aware of having done it. He looked back at his coffee, and the expression settled back into the steadiness she knew, but different now, not closed, not managed, just steady in the way of a man who has set something down that he'd been carrying too long. Clara looked at him and said nothing. She stored it somewhere careful and did not examine it right away the way you store something precious until you have the proper time to look at it. Tomorrow they would prepare for Billings. Thursday they would ride. And Bernard Holt in his gray suit across the dark territory had no idea what was coming. He had tried to take her land. He had tried to intimidate her, threaten her, burn her neighbors out, and bury her in fraudulent documents. He had believed the way men like him always believed, that a woman alone with no money and no standing, and a piece of difficult land at the edge of civilization, was a problem that solved itself. He had been wrong about every single part of that. And in 3 days, he was going to find out exactly how wrong. They rode out for Billings on Thursday before the sun was fully up, and they rode as a group that Bernard Holt had not anticipated and could not have predicted. Clara and Elias side by side, Carson Webb just behind them, Frank Kellerman and Samuel Bright behind Webb, and Roy Sutter at the rear, because Elias had told him to stay home, and Roy had said yes sir, with the particular inflection that meant he was going to do the opposite. Clara had the notebooks in her saddlebag. Webb had the confirmation telegram and 14 pages of family statements. Samuel had the authenticated copy of the Whitlock deed that had come back from Helena 6 days ago, and 3 additional documents that Webb had pulled from the Territorial Records Office through a contact who owed him a favor and had delivered quietly and fast. They did not talk much on the road. There was a quality to the silence among them that Clara recognized from the Kellerman kitchen, the particular focused quiet of people who have decided something and are now simply moving toward it. It was Frank who broke it about an hour out. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, riding up beside her. "Clara," she said. He accepted that with a nod. "I need you to know something," he said. "Before we get there, before any of this happens in front of a judge." He paused in the way of a man choosing words carefully because the words matter. "When Holt first came to us, when Crane showed up with those papers and started talking about the survey discrepancy, I almost signed it. The first visit, June talked me out of it. She said, 'Wait,' she said, 'Think,' she said, 'Something is wrong with this, and I need you to look at it again.'" He looked at Clara. "If she hadn't said that, we'd be working someone else's land right now, and I wouldn't be here." Another pause. "What you're doing, what you've built, you and Mr. Thornwood and Mr. Webb, it's giving me the chance to use the time my wife bought me. I just needed you to know I understand that." Clara held his gaze. "June's a remarkable woman," she said. "I know it," Frank said. "I've known it for 17 years. I don't always say it enough." He dropped back to his position behind Webb, and Clara rode forward into the quiet morning, and she thought about June Kellerman standing at her stove with her back to the room so no one would see her cry, and then turning around anyway because the question needed an answer. She thought the women in this territory are extraordinary, and nobody writes it down. She thought, I am going to write it down. The federal district judge was a man named Harlan Morse, and he was not what Clara had expected. She had expected, based on accumulated experience with men in official positions, either dismissal or condescension or both. What she got instead was a compact gray-haired man of about 60 who read every page of what Webb put in front of him without speaking, asked 3 precise questions when he was done, and then sat back and looked at Clara directly. "You're the one who found the surveyor connection," he said. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "Walk me through it," Morse said. "How it connected, what you saw, and when." She walked him through it. She did not rush, and she did not elaborate beyond what was factually demonstrable, because she had learned from her mother that the most persuasive version of a true thing is the plain version without ornament. Morse listened the way Webb had listened, completely without interruption. When she finished, he looked at his notes. "The signature of a man dead 11 years, Morse said. On 5 documents, across 3 counties, filed at intervals consistent with a deliberate rotation designed to avoid pattern detection." "Yes, sir," Clara said. Morse looked at Webb. "You have the death record, confirmed by the Territorial Records Office, and the county of Reeves's death," Webb said. "Died September 1874, influenza." Morse looked at the documents again. Then he did something Clara hadn't expected. He looked at Frank Kellerman, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table since they came in. "Mr. Kellerman," Morse said. Frank straightened. "Sir." "Your barn," Morse said. 3 nights ago." "Yes, sir." "You believe it was deliberate?" "I know it was deliberate," Frank said. "I've been on that land 14 years. I know what an accidental fire looks like. This wasn't one." "Can you prove it?" Frank hesitated. "Not the way a lawyer means prove it," he said. But the burn pattern. The burn pattern has been documented, Webb said, and produced a fourth document from his bag, which Clara recognized as the notes Webb had taken the morning after the fire with a hand-drawn diagram of the burn origin point. Accelerant was used at the northwest corner of the structure, away from any possible accidental ignition source. Morse looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "Mr. Webb," he said, "what are you asking me for today?" "An emergency injunction," Webb said. "Suspending all pending property actions associated with Bernard Holt and any entities he controls, pending full federal investigation. And a warrant for the arrest of Holt, his associate Crane, and any officials found to have participated in the scheme." He paused. "Including whoever ordered the fire." Morse set down his pen. He looked around the table at Webb, at Clara, at Frank, at Samuel, at Elias, who had sat through the entire proceeding without speaking, and whose silence had a weight to it that Clara thought any judge worth his position would feel. "Mr. Thornwood," Morse said. Elias met his eyes. "Judge." "You've been listening for 2 hours without saying a word," Morse said. "I'd like to hear from you." "Everything Mrs. Whitlock and Mr. Webb have presented is accurate," Elias said. "I can confirm the water filing on the Whitlock Spring from my own land records, which document the spring as a shared boundary feature since 1871. I can confirm the relationship between Holt and Price through 2 conversations I personally witnessed. And I can tell you—" He stopped for a moment. When he continued, his voice had the same quality it had on the road when he talked about Margaret. Stripped down, without management. "I can tell you that I have watched this man operate in this territory for 3 years, and I did not act because it was not yet on my land, and that inaction allowed harm to come to families I have known for years. I am not proud of that, but I am here now, and I am telling you that everything in front of you is real, and that the people who prepared it are telling the complete truth." The room was very quiet. Morse looked at Elias for a moment longer than he'd looked at anyone else. Then he picked up his pen. "I'm granting the injunction," he said. "Effective immediately. All pending Holt-associated actions suspended." He began writing. "I'm also issuing the warrants. Webb coordinate with the territorial marshal. I want Holt and Crane in custody before the end of the week." He didn't look up from his writing. "And I want a full accounting of every property transaction associated with these documents, going back to the first filing. Every family affected is to receive formal notification that their case is under federal review." He paused. "With a personal letter from this office, not a form." Webb looked at Clara. Clara looked at her hands and said nothing because she didn't trust her voice right at that moment, and she thought the judge probably didn't need to see that. They rode back toward Willow Creek in the late afternoon with the sun at their backs and something that felt different from what had ridden out with them in the morning. Not relief exactly. The thing wasn't finished yet. Holt was still free until the marshal found him, and nothing was returned to anyone yet, but the specific feeling of a door that has been locked for a long time swinging open. Not all the way, but open. Frank rode the whole way back without speaking. Clara understood that. She let him have it. It was Roy, of all people, who said the thing that needed saying. He pulled up beside Clara about an hour from Willow Creek and rode in silence for a while, and then said without preamble, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "Tell me," Clara said. "I keep thinking about the morning I showed up at your cabin with that hand," Roy said. "I was half out of my mind with the pain of it, and I thought you were going to be some kind of eccentric out here with her herbs and her box of remedies, and I was going to be polite about it, and then go find a real doctor." He looked at his hand on the reins. "And instead, you looked at that wound, and you talked to me like I was a person, and you fixed it. No fuss. Just fixed it." He paused. "And I thought, well, that's something." "It wasn't anything remarkable," Clara said. "Ma'am," Roy said with the gentle firmness of a man who has decided to correct someone and is going to see it through. "It was the most remarkable thing I'd seen in 6 years of working for a man who is not easy to impress. Because I went back and told Mr. Thornwood about it, and I watched his face while I was telling him, and something happened in it that I hadn't seen happen in 6 years. He looked at her. "I didn't know what it was then. I know now." Clara looked at the road ahead. "He came alive a little," Roy said simply. "Just a little. Like a lamp that's been turned down so low you forgot it was on, and someone turned it back up. He went quiet for a moment. I thought you ought to know that. Because I think you know a lot of things, Mrs. Whitlock, but I'm not sure you know that. She didn't answer him. She couldn't write at that moment. She wrote in silence until the feeling passed into something she could breathe around, and then she said, "Thank you, Roy." And he dropped back without pressing it, which was exactly right. Elias rode beside her the last 30 minutes without speaking, and it was a silence she had come to know as well as any of his words. Companionable present pointed in the same direction she was pointed. Just before the turnoff to her property, he said, "He's going to run." "I know," Clara said. "When Holt hears about the injunction, he'll hear today," Clara said. "Someone in Billings will send word. He has people watching." She had thought about this on the ride back. He has two choices: run and confirm everything, or stay and fight it, which means he has to counter what we've built in front of a federal judge with a fraudulent surveyor's signature on 5 documents. She paused. "He's going to run." "The marshal," Elias started. "The marshal will try," Clara said. "Whether he's fast enough depends on how much of a head start Holt gets." She looked at Elias. "What's the fastest route out of the territory from Willow Creek?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "North road to the river crossing," he said. "Then west. If he makes the crossing before dark, he's into unincorporated territory, and the marshal's jurisdiction gets complicated." "How long from Willow Creek to the river crossing?" "Hard ride, 4 hours." Clara looked at the sky. It was past 4. The injunction had been granted at 2. "Someone sent word the moment we walked out of Morse's office," she said. "If Holt left within the hour—" "He's already gone," Elias said. They looked at each other. "Then we make sure he can't come back," Clara said. "The federal case doesn't need him present to proceed. The warrants follow him wherever he goes. The injunction stands regardless. The properties can be reviewed and restored without him in custody." She paused. "It's better if they catch him, but the work is done either way." Elias was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, that open, unguarded quality that had been appearing more frequently, like weather that had changed and wasn't changing back. "You're not angry that he might get away," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation from a man trying to understand. "I'm furious," Clara said. "But fury and strategy are different tools, and you can't use them at the same time." She looked at the road. "If he runs, the federal case is actually cleaner. A man who runs is a man who confirmed he had something to run from. Morse will use that." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father would have liked you too," he said. Clara looked at him. "I used to say that the mark of a person worth knowing is how they think when things go sideways." Elias said. "Not when everything's working, when it's not." He held her gaze. "You think better sideways than most people think upright." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Come to supper tonight. Bring Roy if he wants to come. I'll cook something real." Something happened in Elias's face, a warmth quick and genuine that she was beginning to be able to read as the thing he felt before he decided whether to show it. "I'll come," he said. "Roy can find his own supper." Roy, who was close enough to have heard this, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was clearly in that family. The news about Holt came the next morning, and it was both better and worse than Clara had predicted. Holt had not run. He had stayed. He had spent the night according to Dora Finch's network of information, which Clara had come to regard as the most reliable intelligence service in the Montana Territory meeting, with men in the back room of one of the saloons. And what he had been doing in that back room was not planning an escape. He had been planning a response. The response arrived at Clara's cabin at 8 in the morning in the form of Holt himself. No crane. No hired men. Just Bernard Holt in his gray suit standing at her door, and Clara opened it before he'd knocked, because she'd seen him coming up the road, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him and waited. He looked different than he had on Main Street. Not smaller exactly. He was still a big, substantial man with the physical confidence of someone accustomed to using his size as part of his argument. But something in his certainty had gone slightly ragged around the edges, the way expensive fabric goes when it's been put through conditions it wasn't made for. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. "I'd like to talk," he said. "You can talk from there," she said. "I'm not inviting you in." He accepted that. He put his hands in his coat pockets in the manner of a man demonstrating that he had decided his hands were not currently a threat. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot," he said. Clara looked at him. "You tried to forge my deed on Main Street on the day I arrived," she said. "You filed a fraudulent claim on my spring before I got here. You left a threatening note on my door. And you burned Frank Kellerman's barn with his children 20 feet away." She paused. "Which specific foot would you like to revisit?" Holt's jaw tightened. He managed it. "I'm prepared to offer a resolution," he said. "The pending claims against your property and the Kellerman property, I can withdraw those, immediately, in writing." "The pending claims," Clara said, "were suspended yesterday by a federal district judge. You can't withdraw them. They've already been taken from you." Holt's composure cracked along a very specific line. Not anger, not surprise, but the look of a man who had arrived with a card he believed was strong and discovered it was already played. "I have resources in this territory," he started. "You have a county assessor who spent yesterday afternoon giving a voluntary statement to Carson Webb," Clara said. "You have a circuit judge whose name appears in Webb's case file. You have a man named Crane who has been issued a federal warrant and who, based on what I know of men who understand which way a situation is moving, has probably already started considering his own options." She watched his face. "Your resources are becoming unavailable to you very quickly, Mr. Holt." He stared at her. "What do you want?" he said. "Not negotiating now, just asking." The gray suit reduced to the man inside it, which was smaller than the suit had suggested. "I want 7 families to get their land back," Clara said. "I want the Adlers to stop working someone else's property for wages. I want the Kellermans to rebuild their barn with their own money on their own land and not be afraid of who's going to come next. I want every fraudulent filing you've made in this territory pulled and corrected and the families affected compensated for what it cost them to fight you." She held his eyes. "And I want you to stand in front of Judge Morse and say every single thing you did out loud on the record, so that there is no version of events where the families you harmed look like anything other than what they were, people who were lied to and stolen from." "That's not a negotiation," Holt said. "That's a surrender." "Yes," Clara said, "it is." The silence stretched long enough that a crow called somewhere in the distance, and the spring ran its quiet sound from the east, and the whole morning held its breath. "And if I do those things," Holt said. His voice had gone flat, all the performance stripped out of it. "What happens to me?" "That's between you and Judge Morse," Clara said. "I'm not a judge. I'm just a woman whose spring you tried to steal." She looked at him steadily. "But I'll tell you what I know about Harlan Morse. He cares about the record being clear. He cares about the families being made whole. Whether you cooperate or run tells him something about whether you understand what you've done, and he weighs that." She paused. "That's all I know." Holt looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way he should have looked at her on Main Street that first day. Not as an obstacle or a target, but as a person who was going to be there whether he wanted her to be or not. "You tore up my deed on Main Street," he said. "I thought you were being hysterical." "I know," Clara said. "I thought you'd be gone within the week," he said. "I know that too," she said. He looked at the property behind her. At the cabin, the garden, the fence line, the cleared spring on the east boundary. At what a woman alone with a cedar box and a worn travel bag had built in 6 weeks. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she couldn't read and didn't try to. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode away. He turned himself in to the territorial marshal that afternoon. Dora Finch's network confirmed it by supper time. The news moved through Willow Creek, the way important things move through small towns, fast and layered, because everyone added what they knew and what they suspected and what they'd seen with their own eyes, and what came out at the end was not perfectly accurate, but was essentially true. Bernard Holt had surrendered to federal authority, and it was because of the woman on the Whitlock parcel and the rancher who hadn't smiled in 10 years, and something large and long overdue had finally come to an end. Clara heard about it from Roy, who rode over at dusk with the news and the particular expression of a man who has been waiting a while for something and has just watched it arrive. She thanked him and stood in her doorway after he left and breathed the evening air and thought about Billings and Morse and Webb and 14 pages of statements and a dead surveyor's signature and all the distance between tearing up a deed on Main Street and watching the man who forged it ride to the marshal's office on his own. She thought it's not finished. The families still needed to be notified. The properties still needed to be formally reviewed. The compensation still needed to be calculated and delivered. Webb still had months of work ahead. Samuel Bright would be filing documents until winter. She thought, but the door is open. Elias arrived at 7, which was when she'd told him supper would be ready, and he arrived precisely at 7, because that was the kind of man he was, and he came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw her face. "You heard," he said. "Roy told me," she said. "Come in. Supper's getting cold." He came in. They sat across from each other at the table where she'd eaten alone every night since arriving, and she'd cooked enough for 2 people with the naturalness of someone who had stopped noticing when it started feeling natural, and they ate and they talked, and what they talked about was not Holt or Morse or Webb, but small things. His father's ranch, her mother's remedy book, the spring on the eastern boundary, and what she planned to do with the secondary channel. Now that the waterwork was done, a story he told about Roy's first week on the ranch that made Clara laugh out loud, which made Elias stop talking and look at her with an expression she felt rather than saw. "What?" she said. "You have a very good laugh," he said, like it was a simple fact that needed stating. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight with supper between them, and the quiet evening outside, and the spring running its constant sound on the east boundary. He looked like what he was, a man who had been somewhere very dark for a long time, and had walked far enough back toward the light that you could see the difference. "Elias," she said. "Clara," he said. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." He set down his fork. He gave her his complete attention, which was the kind of attention most people never learn to give fully present, without preparation for what he'd say next. "I'm listening," he said. "When I came to this territory," she said, "I came with one intention: to work the land my father left me, and to build something real on it, and to prove to myself and to anyone watching that I was capable of doing that alone." She held his gaze. "I did not come looking for what has happened between us. I wasn't looking for it. I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said. "But I also need to be honest about what I've found," she said. "Because I am not a woman who says less than she means to protect herself. I've done that too long and it costs too much." She took a breath. "You have been the most unexpected thing in this entire unexpected season of my life. Not because you're powerful, or because you helped me fight Holt, though you did, and it mattered, but because you are the first man in my memory who looked at me and adjusted for everything he'd assumed, and then looked again, and then kept looking." Her voice stayed level because she needed it level. "You saw me. Not the size of me, not the oddity of me, not the usefulness of me. Me. And I don't know what to do with that yet entirely. But I know I don't want to be quiet about it." Elias was very still. "I'm not asking you for a promise," Clara said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm telling you plainly, because you deserve to be told plainly." The lamplight was very steady. Outside, something moved in the grass, the wind or an animal, or the simple living sound of a Montana night. The spring ran. The evening held. Elias reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance. Just his hand covering hers, warm and certain. "Clara May Whitlock," he said in the voice he used when he'd decided something entirely. "I have been a man who couldn't feel much of anything for 10 years. I told myself it was grief. I told myself it was right. I told myself Margaret's memory deserved the whole of what I had left." His hand pressed hers slightly. "And then a woman moved onto the parcel next to mine and called me by my first name like it was the most natural thing in the world, and told me 8 of my cattle were in her garden, and—" The corner of his mouth moved. And something that had been still for a very long time moved. Clara looked at his hand over hers. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I am not demonstrative. I am not quick to speak what I feel, and I have spent 10 years building habits that don't yield fast. I can't promise you I'll be otherwise." He met her eyes directly. "But I can promise you this. I will look at you, always. Not at what you can do, not at what you've built, not at how you've surprised me. At you." He paused. "And I will never, as long as I'm standing, let you doubt that you are worth exactly the ground you stand on." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was the fullest quiet Clara had known in years. "That," she said, "is an acceptable promise." His hand tightened on hers for a moment. Then he sat back and picked up his fork and said, "This is very good, about the supper," and she said, "Don't sound so surprised." And he said, "I'm not surprised at anything you do anymore. That's the point." And she laughed again, and he looked at her again with that expression, and this time she looked back and let him see that she saw it. Outside the territory was settling into night. The families in their homes, the marshal in his office, the federal case building itself, document by document, in Webb's careful hands. The injunction standing, the warrants issued, the door open, and in the cabin on the Whitlock parcel. Two people who had not expected each other sat across a table in the lamplight and talked until the fire burned low, and neither of them moved to end the evening. And when Elias finally stood to go, he held her hand for a moment at the door and said good night in a voice that meant something larger than the words. And Clara said good night back in the same voice, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride away into the dark. She did not go back inside immediately. She stood on the porch and looked at the stars, the same stars she'd looked at the very first night she arrived, when she lay on a bedroll on an uncertain floor and asked herself what she was doing, and answered, "The only thing I can do." The spring ran on the eastern boundary, steady and clear, and entirely unconcerned with legal documents or fraudulent deeds, or the particular geography of two people finding each other at the edge of the world. It just ran. The way things that are true run quietly and constantly, and without needing anyone's permission. The first letter from the Federal Land Office arrived on a Monday, 3 weeks after Holt turned himself in, and Clara read it standing at her door in the early morning with her coffee going cold in her other hand. It was addressed to Mrs. Clara May Whitlock, and it confirmed that the fraudulent filing on the eastern spring of the Whitlock parcel had been formally struck from the territorial record. The spring, the secondary channels, and all associated water rights were confirmed as belonging exclusively to the Whitlock property. The filing was void. It had never been legal. It was as if Bernard Holt had never touched it. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the cedar box on top of the original deed, on top of her father's photograph, on top of her mother's remedy book. She pressed the lid closed with both hands and held it there for a moment. "All right, Papa," she said quietly to the box and the photograph inside it, and the man she was talking to through both. "We're keeping it." She went back inside and finished her coffee and went to work. The weeks that followed moved fast and full in the way of weeks that have real content in them. Not the manufactured urgency of Holt's deadlines and threatening notes, but the solid, satisfying weight of things being set right. Carson Webb worked out of Dora Finch's sitting room for the better part of a month, and Dora charged him a fair rate for the use of it, and fed him supper every night, and told Clara privately that he was a decent man who needed someone to make sure he ate regularly, which she had appointed herself to handle. Samuel Bright filed documents until his hand cramped. He told Clara at one point with the expression of a man discovering something late, but genuinely, that he had gone to law because he believed in the idea of it and had spent 6 years in Willow Creek watching the practice of it fall short of the idea, and that the past month had been the first time he had felt like the two things were the same. "Don't get sentimental, Samuel," Clara said. "I'm not sentimental," Samuel said. "I'm accurate." The Adler family was the first to have their property formally restored. Ruth Adler came to Clara's the morning after the confirmation arrived and stood in the doorway and didn't say anything for a moment, and Clara didn't fill the silence. And then Ruth said, "We're going home." And her voice broke exactly once on the word home, and then steadied, and Clara said, "I know." And Ruth reached out and took both Clara's hands and held them hard for a moment, and then left because she had packing to do. Clara stood in her doorway and watched her go, and did not try to make her feelings about it into words, because some things are better honored by not being translated. The Kellermans began rebuilding the barn the following week. Frank organized it the way he organized everything methodically, without drama showing up at first light, and working until there was no more light to work by. What he hadn't planned for was that on the first morning of the rebuild, 11 men showed up with tools and timber, and no explanation, just the expectation of being put to work. Roy Sutter was among them. So was Coot. So were 4 of Elias's ranch hands. So were 3 men Clara had never met, who turned out to be neighbors of the Kellermans, who had watched the barn burn from a distance, and had been waiting for the moment to do something about it. Frank stood in his yard, looking at 11 men with tools, and couldn't speak for a moment. "Well," June said from beside him, "don't just stand there. Put them to work." Frank put them to work. The barn went up in 4 days. On the 4th evening, someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and someone else produced a jug of something that wasn't coffee, and the Kellerman yard became, without anyone having planned it, a celebration. Clara was there. Elias was there, standing at the edge of the yard with his coffee. Actual coffee, because he didn't drink from jugs. Watching the fiddle player with the expression of a man who has been reminded of something he had forgotten he missed. Roy was dancing with Dora Finch's niece, who had come with Dora, and doing it with a complete lack of skill and a complete surplus of enthusiasm that made everyone near him laugh. "You should dance," Clara said, coming to stand beside Elias. "I don't dance," Elias said. "You used to," she said. He looked at her. "Roy," he said. "Roy didn't tell me anything," Clara said. "You did. You told me Margaret loved to dance, which means you danced with her." She held his gaze. "You haven't forgotten how. You just decided you weren't going to anymore." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fiddle player, and then at Roy, making an absolute spectacle of himself, and then at Clara. "I'm not very good," he said. "Neither is Roy," Clara said. "He seems to be surviving it." Something moved in Elias's face, that warmth she had come to know, as well as his steadiness. The thing that lived just under the surface and came up when he stopped managing it. He held out his hand. Clara took it. They danced, and he was not as bad as he'd claimed, and she was not as graceful as she'd have liked, and neither of them cared at all. Around them the yard moved and the fiddle played, and Frank Kellerman laughed a real laugh, full-throated and unguarded, and June heard it from across the yard, and turned to find him, and smiled the smile of a woman who has been waiting a long time for that specific sound. Elias and Clara danced through one song and into the beginning of the next, and somewhere in the middle of the second song, he stopped leading, and they were just moving together in the comfortable, unself-conscious way of people who have found each other's rhythm, and he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear, "I forgot what this felt like." "Which part?" she said. "All of it," he said. "The music, the people, the—" He paused. "Not being alone." Clara looked at him. "You're not alone," she said. "You haven't been for a while now." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "I haven't." The word came from Vernon Price, of all people, 4 days later. He came to Clara's cabin in the morning, not with the heavy-set official authority of the first visit, but quiet and on foot, having tied his horse at the road, which Clara thought was a gesture of something not quite humility, but an understanding that he had forfeited the right to arrive with confidence. She opened the door and looked at him and waited. "I wanted to tell you myself," Price said, "before you heard it from someone else." He turned his hat in his hands, in the manner she had come to associate with men who were trying to tell the truth about something difficult. "My full statement is on record with Webb. Everything I knew, everything I did, the timeline of how Holt approached me, and what he used." He paused. "He found out my wife had a debt. From before we came here. Something she'd done when she was young and didn't know better, and had been trying to put behind her for 15 years. His jaw tightened. "He found out about it and told me the debt would become public and legal unless I cooperated. I had been cooperating for 2 years before I understood clearly what I was cooperating with." Clara looked at him steadily. "Did your wife know?" she said. "No," Price said. "She didn't know about the cooperation. She didn't know I'd been helping him." He stopped. "I told her last week. About the debt and about what I'd done. He was quiet for a moment. That was the hardest conversation I've ever had. Is she still with you? Clara said. Yes, Price said, simply. Clara thought about that, about the specific courage of staying. She's a strong woman, she said. The strongest I know, Price said. He looked at Clara directly. I know that what I did caused harm to people who didn't deserve it. I can't fix that with a conversation. But I wanted you to know that I understand it, and I'm sorry for it, and everything I can do to correct it, I'm doing. He paused. Webb says my full cooperation changes my position considerably in terms of what Morse decides about charges. Probably true, Clara said. That's not why I'm telling you, Price said. I'm telling you because you asked me a question that day on the Thornwood porch. You asked me whether Holt was paying me or threatening me, and you said the distinction mattered. He met her eyes. You were the first person who asked that. Everyone else just called me corrupt. You asked why. His voice went slightly rough. I needed to tell you that it mattered. That you asking it like that, like there might be a real answer worth hearing, was the thing that made me think I could tell the truth. Clara was quiet for the moment. Price, she said. Go home to your wife. He nodded. He put his hat. He walked back to his horse at the road and rode away, and Clara stood in her doorway and thought about the versions of people they would rather be, and the moments when someone holds up a mirror and lets them see that version is still there, still possible, still worth choosing. What came next? Clara did not see coming, and she should have. She had been watching the whole picture clearly enough. She simply had not included herself in it. It was Webb who told her on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting across her table with the particular expression of a man delivering information he's uncertain about receiving. The properties are being restored, Webb said. The families are getting their land back. The case against Holt is solid. Morse expects a full prosecution with these documents and the testimony in hand. He paused. Crane has been taken into custody in Wyoming. He's talking. Good, Clara said. The circuit judge, the one with the arrangement, has resigned his position, Webb said. Effective immediately. The territorial governor accepted it without comment, which is how those things go. Good, Clara said again. Webb looked at his hands. There's one more thing, he said. The spring filing. The fraudulent one Holt filed 6 months before you arrived. It's been struck, Clara said. I have the letter. Yes, Webb said. But in reviewing the circumstances of that filing, the probate monitoring the Billings connection, we found something. He looked at her. Holt wasn't just watching for properties with female inheritors. He was specifically watching for properties that had existing water features not fully documented in the original filing. Because in territorial law, an undocumented water feature on a homestead claim can be separately filed by a third party if the original claimant hasn't established active use. Clara looked at him. He wasn't just trying to take my land, she said. He was trying to take the spring specifically. Your spring connects to the same aquifer that feeds the Thornwood Southwest pasture, Webb said. If he had controlled the water rights to that spring, he would have had leverage over the largest, most productive ranch in the county. He paused. And the way he planned to use that leverage wasn't blackmail. It was purchase. He was going to force Elias into a water rights negotiation from a position of absolute need. Clara sat very still. He was never coming for my land, she said. I was the door. He was coming for the Thornwood Ranch. That's our assessment, Webb said. The quiet in the cabin was complete. Does Elias know? Clara said. Not yet, Webb said. I wanted to tell you first. She told him that evening. She rode to the Thornwood Ranch herself, because this was not news for a letter or a message through Roy. Elias was in the yard when she arrived, and he saw her face when she got down from her horse, and whatever he read there made him go very still. Come inside, he said. She told him everything. He listened the way he listened, completely without interruption. When she finished, he stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the wall, and she gave him that moment without filling it. My ranch, he said. Yes, she said. He was going to use your spring to corner my water supply. Yes. And you were... He stopped. turned around. You were the mechanism. He chose your property because of what it connects to, because of what was underneath it. His voice was very controlled in the way it got when he was working hard to keep it that way. You came here because your father left you a piece of land, and you were the door he chose because behind you was me. Yes, Clara said. That's what it looks like. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not anger, though anger was there, but something more complicated and more personal. You could have been run off this land, he said, on the first day. If you'd signed that deed on Main Street, you'd have been gone before you knew what you were standing over. I know, she said. And he would have been in my water within the year, Elias said. He said it like a man counting the distance between what happened and what almost did, and finding it smaller than he can easily hold. Elias, Clara said. He looked at her. He failed, she said. Every part of it. He failed at the deed. He failed at the threatening note. He failed at using Price. He failed at the Kellerman barn. He failed at Billings, and he failed at the spring, and he's going to fail in front of Morse. She held his gaze. He built a very careful plan, and it fell apart because I tore up a piece of paper on Main Street and refused to leave. She paused. That's the whole story. Elias looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her. It was not a tentative thing, and it was not a question. It was a man who had decided completely and without reservation, and was saying so in the only language that didn't require management or careful word selection. Clara kissed him back with the same certainty because she had stopped being tentative about this some time ago. She simply hadn't said so yet. When they stepped back from each other, the room was very quiet and entirely different from what it had been 60 seconds before. I should have done that 2 weeks ago, Elias said. You should have done it 3 weeks ago, Clara said. Something crossed his face, genuine, unguarded, the full version of what she had been seeing glimpses of since that first day. He laughed. Not the ghost of it. Not the suppressed almost. A real laugh, warm and sudden, the laugh of a man who has found something he thought he'd lost the way back to. Clara heard it and felt it land somewhere in her chest, like the first warm day after a long winter. Not dramatic, not a revelation, just simply and completely right. He had not laughed in 10 years. He laughed now in his own kitchen with his hands still warm from her face, and it sounded like a man coming home. The hearing before Judge Morse was held on a Tuesday in late September, and Willow Creek sent more people to Billings for it than had ever traveled together for any purpose in the county's history. Dora Finch came. Ruth Adler came with her husband, who was back on his own land for 3 weeks now, and walked with the straightened spine of a man who has been given back what was taken from him. Frank and June Kellerman came, June wearing her good dress and holding Frank's arm with the particular grip of a woman who has been through something with a person and come out the other side still holding on. Samuel Bright came with 4 folders of documents. Roy Sutter came because he went everywhere that mattered. Holt stood before Morse and entered his plea, and his lawyer spoke, and Webb spoke, and Clara was called to testify and testified with the same plain clarity she had brought to everything. No ornament, no drama, just the facts in the order they connected and the conclusions those connections supported. When it was over, when Morse had ruled, and the courtroom had processed what the ruling meant, the first sound was not from any of the official parties. It was from Ruth Adler, who exhaled. A single, complete, long-held breath finally released. The sound of it in the quiet courtroom was the most honest thing Clara had heard in months. The ride back to Willow Creek was not quiet. Frank talked for most of it, which was new. He was not normally a talkative man, and Clara thought the words had been dammed up behind the fear for so long that the removal of the fear left them with nowhere to go but out. June listened to him with the expression of a woman who has earned the right to find her husband's voice the finest sound in the world. Roy sang intermittently and badly, and nobody told him to stop. Elias rode beside Clara and said very little, which was how he always was, but the quality of his silence was the one she had come to know as contentment present, easy, pointed at the same horizon she was pointed at. "What do you want to do with the spring channel when the season turns?" he said after a while. "Extend the secondary branch further south," Clara said. It'll increase the flow to your pasture through winter. I'll put men on it, he said. Your direction. Our direction, she said. He looked at her. Our direction, he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world, which it was. What happened in Willow Creek over the months that followed was not sudden and was not dramatic and was exactly right. The town changed the way towns change when something that has been wrong for a long time is corrected, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, one after another, each one a small adjustment toward something better. The Adlers rebuilt. The Kellermans rebuilt. 3 other families found their footing returning under them slowly, and then with more confidence, the way you test ice before you trust it. Samuel Bright took on 2 new clients who had been afraid to bring their cases forward before, and were afraid no longer. Dora Finch's boarding house became in a shift so gradual that nobody could have said exactly when it happened, the place where people brought problems. They needed help thinking through because Dora's sitting room had been the place where the thinking that mattered had happened, and the association stuck. Clara's medicinal practice grew without her advertising. It grew through the simple mechanism of people telling other people that she knew what she was doing, and she treated everyone who came to her door the same way, which was with complete attention and no judgment. She wrote to a doctor in Denver who was doing research on Western plant medicine, and he wrote back, and they began a correspondence that lasted years. She expanded the South Garden in October. She started teaching a girl named Annie Pratt, 12 years old, sharp as a new blade and hungry for exactly the kind of knowledge Clara had to give, to identify and work with medicinal plants on Thursday afternoons. Annie's mother had initially been uncertain about the arrangement and had changed her mind the week Annie correctly identified the early signs of infection in her little brother's cut knee, and told her mother to clean it with boiled water and the yarrow preparation she'd brought home from Clara's garden. "You're teaching children," Elias said when Clara told him about Annie. "One child," Clara said. "So far." He looked at her with an expression she knew meant he was putting things together. "Your mother taught you," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "And her mother taught her," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how it survives," he said. "Not in books, in the teaching." "My mother always said that," Clara said. "Knowledge only belongs to you until you give it away. Then it belongs to everyone." Elias looked at her the way he did sometimes, like she had said a thing that landed somewhere in him that he hadn't known was empty. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I put a marker on Margaret's grave last month," he said. "A proper one. I'd never—" He stopped. Started again. "I'd kept it simple. Just her name and the dates. For 10 years. I told myself it was what she would have wanted, but the truth is, I couldn't stand to make it more permanent than it already was." He held Clara's eyes. "Last month I had a stone made, with her name and the dates and something she used to say." He paused. "I thought you should know." "What did she used to say?" Clara said. "She used to say, 'The only wasted day is the one you spend being less than you are,'" Elias said. "She said it to me about once a week, usually when I was being stubborn about something." Clara thought about that. "She was right," she said. "She usually was," Elias said. There was sadness in it, but not the old sadness, not the sadness that locked doors and kept the world out. The sadness of someone who has loved well and lost truly and learned painfully and slowly and with help to carry it without being carried by it. "I can say that now without it being the only thing I feel," he said. "That she was right. That I miss her. And that I am—" He looked at Clara steadily. "That I am grateful. For what's here." Clara held his gaze. She thought about her mother and the 5 years of misplaced guilt. She thought about her father's photograph in the cedar box. She thought about 1,100 miles on a rattling stage and a torn deed fluttering in Willow Creek dust, and a spring that ran under legal boundaries without asking permission. "Elias," she said. "Clara," he said. "I want to stay," she said. "On this land. This is where I'm meant to be. I want you to know that regardless of anything else, this is where I'm meant to be." "I know," he said. "I've known it since you told me 8 of my cattle were in your garden." The corner of his mouth moved, and then kept moving into the full, real, unheld thing. "You were never leaving." "I was never leaving," she confirmed. He held out his hand. She took it. They stood in the evening at the edge of her property, their property's shared boundary with the spring running below them, and the Montana sky doing what it did in October, which was perform itself with a total lack of modesty, all color and scale, and the particular beauty of a thing that doesn't need to be told it's beautiful. "I'm going to ask you something," Elias said. "And I'm going to ask it plainly, because you've always required plainness from me, and you've been right to." "Ask it," Clara said. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a performance, not a speech. 4 words in his own voice from the man who had chosen each one carefully, because each one was true. "Not because you need what I have or I need what you can do, because I want to walk the boundary of this land with you for the rest of my life, and know you're walking it with me." Clara looked at him. She looked at his hand holding hers, and his face in the October light, and 10 years of pain that had found its way slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable help to this moment. This plain, unhurried, completely real moment at the edge of the land she had come 1,100 miles to claim. "Yes," she said. Plainly and without reservation. "Yes." He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and when he looked at her again, his eyes were bright with something that was not grief, and was not managed, and was not the careful steadiness that had protected him for so long. It was simply happiness uncomplicated, and present the happiness of a man who had forgotten he was still capable of it, and has just found out he was wrong. They were married in November, on a cold, clear morning. The kind Margaret Thornwood had loved honest before the heat came, and everything started pretending, and the whole of Willow Creek came, which was not something anyone had predicted, and was perhaps the most accurate measure of what the past months had built. The Adlers came. The Kellermans came with all 4 children, and the new barn visible from the road. Samuel Bright came and cried quietly into his handkerchief, and denied it afterward. Dora Finch wore her good hat and organized the food with the efficient authority of a woman who considers feeding people a moral act. Roy Sutter stood beside Elias with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man watching the best possible version of something he had hoped for come true. Annie Pratt came with her mother, and wore her good dress, and brought a small bunch of yarrow from Clara's garden, tied with a blue ribbon, which she pressed into Clara's hands before the ceremony and said, "For luck, Mrs. Whitlock. My mother says you make your own, but it doesn't hurt to have some anyway." Clara held the yarrow through the whole ceremony. When it was over, when Elias had said his vows, in his own unadorned way, that was more moving for being unadorned, and Clara had said hers with the same plain certainty she brought to everything that mattered. The town of Willow Creek, Montana, which had spent 3 months watching a woman nobody expected, become the person nobody could imagine the place, without responded in the way of communities that have been through something together and know it. They clapped. They cheered. Roy Sutter produced a sound that was technically a whoop, and nobody held it against him. Frank Kellerman laughed that full, unguarded laugh that June had been waiting months to hear regularly, and was now hearing almost daily. Dora Finch took Clara's face in both her hands and said, "Well done, child," in a tone that covered considerably more ground than 3 words should have been able to cover. And Elias Thornwood, the man who had not smiled in 10 years, the man the town had loved and grieved and quietly given up on the rancher who had built walls so high that people had stopped trying to see over them, stood in the morning light with his wife's hand in his and smiled. Not the ghost of it. Not the almost. The real thing, full and present, and entirely unheld, the smile of a man who has been away from himself for a long time and has found the way back. The people of Willow Creek saw it and recognized it for what it was and what it meant and who had made it possible. And they understood in the way communities understand things that matter, that what had happened in their town over the past months was not just a legal victory or a romantic story or a tale of a woman who had surprised everyone by being more than they expected. It was a lesson, the oldest and most necessary kind, that the person everyone overlooks is sometimes the person holding the key to everything. That the heart everyone gives up on is sometimes simply waiting for someone stubborn enough and clear-eyed enough and brave enough to refuse to give up on it. That love, when it is real, does not demand that you forget what you have lost. It simply grows in the same ground, steady and unhurried, and entirely alive, like a spring that finds its way through stone. Because water always finds where there is room to go. Clara May Whitlock came to Willow Creek with a worn travel bag, a cedar box, and 1,100 miles of refusing to be less than she was. She came to claim what was hers and build what her father never could, and prove to everyone watching that she was capable of standing on her own ground. She did all of those things. And then she found in the man nobody thought could feel anything anymore, the one thing she hadn't known she was also looking for. She found someone worth standing beside. And Elias Thornwood, who had not smiled in 10 years, smiled every day for the rest of his life, and every person in Willow Creek who saw it knew exactly who had given it back to him, and exactly what it had cost her, and exactly what kind of woman is worth that price. A woman who arrives with nothing but courage and turns out to have been carrying everything.